This is part 1 of The Spirit Dancer, Tessa Lamar novels, Book 5. Written by Kathryn M. Hearst. Narrated by Holly Adams. Be sure to subscribe to Kathryn's channel where you can find part 2 of this audiobook, along with more of Kathryn's paranormal and contemporary romance novels.
Chapter 1. A grad school professor once told me that change came from great insight or great pain, but mine came in a shiny red sports car and claimed he was my brother. Standing in the yard, sandwiched between my two husbands, I replayed the previous 3 minutes on repeat. An unbelievably handsome stranger had driven up in a car that cost more than most folks made in a year, and that wasn't the weird part. Mr. Tall, Blonde, and Handsome had crossed magical wards that acted like an invisible fence that surrounded our property and only opened for blood relatives. The wards were meant to keep us and the people we loved safe from an ever-growing list of enemies. Yep, we're a paranoid bunch, but we came by it honestly, considering we'd tracked down a half a dozen serial killers, black magic users, and a freaking boo-hag in the previous couple of years. Aaron folded his arms and gave my alleged brother his best intimidating cop stare.
What did you say your name was again?
Killian O'Rourke. The guy looked like he'd just stepped out of a movie screen. To say I didn't see a family resemblance would be the biggest understatement in the history of understatements. Then again, I had no idea what my father's side of my family looked like, so what the heck did I know? And you're my brother? Not only did my voice quiver, but my dang southern accent thickened to Scarlett O'Hara levels. The hurt and abandoned little girl inside me wanted to throw herself into his arms and beg for scraps of information about her daddy. But grown-up Tessa couldn't risk it. Not until I had a DNA test, or, better yet, divine intervention. That I am. He glanced over the property, emerald green eyes landing first on the house I shared with Bryson, Aaron, and our kids, then settling on the little pink cottage that belonged to my great-grandmother.
Sorry to show up and drop a bomb on you.
Is there some place we can talk? My manners warred with my common sense. It was rude to leave a guest standing in the middle of the yard, but there was no way I was inviting him into my home for sweet tea and a chat. Not until I knew he was who he said he was. And therein lay the problem. How the heck could I figure out if he was telling the truth? It seems like a shame to waste such a pretty day. I motioned to a wrought iron table and chairs beneath an enormous live oak tree. Killian gave the pink house one last look before following me to the table. His interest in my great-grandmother's place set me on edge. We had 2 kids, 2 old ladies, and a newborn hiding in there until we gave the all-clear. If we gave the all-clear. The men waited for me to sit. Bryson and Aaron claimed the chairs on either side of me, and Killian sat directly across the table. Unsure what to say, I dropped back and punted. Let's start over. I'm Tessa, and these are my husbands, Bryson and Aaron.
It's a pleasure to finally meet you and your spouses.
If the news that I had 2 hubbies surprised him, he didn't let on.
Unfortunately, this isn't a social call. As I said, our dad is in serious danger.
Our dad? Our dad? My dad! The words hit me like a 2x4 upside the head. Waffling between anger and tears, I held up my hands as if to stop the world or my brain from spinning. This man, whoever he was, didn't need to know how much his words affected me. What sort of danger? As if on cue, his cell phone rang. Killian pulled it from his pocket, glanced at the screen, and frowned.
Excuse me, it's urgent.
Of course. I waited until he walked a safe distance away before blowing out of breath. Holy Moses, kayaking on the Red Sea. I wasn't expecting this today. What do... Bryson held up a finger and whispered a privacy spell. As soon as the soundproof bubble snapped into place, Aaron said,
"I don't like it. How do we know he is who he says he is?"
While I agreed with him, I wasn't ready to dismiss Killian's claims. Not yet. Not when I'd potentially met a member of my father's side of my family. We don't, but he was able to cross the wards.
"I should check to make sure they were not tampered with."
Drawing a slow, deep breath, Bryson closed his eyes. A split second later, his magic caressed my skin as it spread across the 10 or so acres we called home. While I appreciated the fact he was protecting our family, I wished he'd hurried the heck up. If Killian was up to no good, he likely wouldn't stand by while we assessed his magic. But if he was telling the truth, I had questions. 1,062 questions. Bryson sighed, but his shoulders remained tight as bowstrings.
"The wards are intact, but Killian is locked and loaded with magic."
Aaron rubbed his arms.
"That's coming from him? I thought it was Tessa." "So did I. At first."
Bryson met my gaze.
"He may very well be your brother. The similarities are hard to ignore."
My brain stuttered. You think Killian's magic is like mine? I'd sensed the same thing, but had chalked it up to wishful thinking. He didn't have the heat of the firebird. That part of me came from Achila, my birth mother. Killian's magic was stormy and cold, and reminded me of the part of myself that allowed me to talk to the dead. Bryson nodded, but the lines between his brows told me he wasn't happy about it. Do you think he's telling the truth? That my father is in trouble? I didn't know my dad, and the idea of finally meeting him made me dizzy.
"I don't know,"
Bryson took my hand.
"but you'll never forgive yourself if you don't find out. She's not talking to him alone. I'm telling you, there's something off with the guy. One of us should be with her."
Aaron shifted to the edge of his seat as if preparing to launch into action. His unease plucked on my already frazzled nerves. Planting my hands flat on the table, I said, "She's sitting right here and can make up her own mind." Aaron's frown deepened.
"What do you want to do?"
I have no clue. I wished I could let go of the doubt and give Killian a chance, but I'd been fooled before. I needed to know for sure he wasn't using some sort of fey mind trick on us before I could trust him. Is there a spell or something that will prove he's my brother?
Maybe, but we'd need time to research it.
Frustration thickened Bryson's voice. Aaron scratched his jaw.
"Can you reach out to Charlie or Achila to confirm his story?"
I can try, but I'd have better luck tonight when it's quiet. I glanced back at Killian. Nothing about him seemed threatening, but I couldn't let my guard down. Not yet. I had more than just myself to think about. Bryson split his attention between Killian and me.
"It's your call, but you might want to get him out of here before Darlene and the others arrive."
Crap on toast! I'd forgotten about the family dinner to celebrate my cousin Tank's release from jail. The poor guy had witnessed a boo hag running off with his wife's skin, been arrested for her murder, and then thrown in a maximum security psych ward. He deserved a drama-free dinner, or as drama-free as it could get with Darlene at the table. Aaron slung his arm around my shoulder and leaned me close.
"I know how much finding out about your dad means to you, but we need to proceed with caution."
Spoken like a true police detective. Nuzzling into his side, I whispered, "I love that you get it, and I promise I'll be careful." My men exchanged yeah right looks. I absolutely hated it when they ganged up on me, but in this case I understood. Had it not been for the fact the Queen of Nosyville was coming for dinner, I would have put my maybe brother through a Q&A session that would have made the Spanish Inquisition seem like a game of Go Fish. I'll get his number and arrange a meeting when we can all talk in private.
"That sounds like a reasonable plan." But are you sure you're willing to let him leave before you get some answers?
The concern in Bryson's eyes warmed me from head to toe. Sometimes it felt like he understood me better than I understood myself. Their support gave me the courage to do the right thing, even when my inner child wanted to hurl herself at Killian and beg him to stay. I'm sure.
Let's make it quick. Darlene and Stone will be here any minute.
Bryson dissolved the privacy spell and nodded toward my maybe brother.
He's finished his call.
Presenting what I hoped was a picture of a happy family, or at least a united front, we watched as Killian walked back to the table. Unfortunately for me, the closer he came, the more I second-guessed myself. What if my dad is in serious danger? What if I am the only one who can save him? What if he dies while I'm dragging my feet about Killian? Could I ever forgive myself?
Sorry about that.
He met my gaze. Court business. Court business? Aaron perked up a bit.
Are you a lawyer?
Not even close. Perhaps proper introductions are in order. Laughing, he bowed with an honest-to-goodness flourish. Killian O'Rourke, second of the Leprechaun clan, and advisor to Creve, Queen of the East She. I glanced between Bryson and Aaron, unsure of what Killian had said, let alone how to respond. Aaron shrugged. Bryson, however, narrowed his eyes. Fat lot of help they are. I recalled that the East She were Celtic fairies. Bryson and I were Nunnehi, or the Cherokee variety. Then again, if Killian and I shared a father, that'd make me a what? Did it work like dog breeds? Was I a Celtic-y? A Cherotic? Thankfully, Bryson interrupted my visit to Crazy Town.
I'm familiar with the term, she.
Me too, but the rest of what you said went over my head. I realized I'd not only cut him off, but I sounded as uneducated as I felt. We aren't usually so formal, what with titles and all. The space between Killian's brows wrinkled for a split second before he plastered on his Hollywood smile and plopped into his chair.
Forgive me, English isn't my first language. I suppose you could say I speak Faiglish.
Be it my nerves or temporary insanity, I laughed. Loud. Hyenas had nothing on me. Sure, his joke was dumb and racist and he spoke English just fine. But once I started giggling, I couldn't stop. Aaron rested his hand on my shoulder, likely in an effort to calm me down. Bryson ignored my borderline hysteria and continued to stare at Killian.
Let me try again.
His accent changed to nondescript American.
I'm Killian O'Rourke, son of Liam, second of the Leprechaun clan, and advisor to the Queen of the East She.
Liam. My dad's name is Liam. Questions about our father zinged around in my head. What's he like? Does he know about me? Of course he knows about me. How else would Killian know who I am? Why did he stay away my entire life? Where is he now? What kind of trouble was he in? My brain screeched to a halt. Wait a cotton-picking second. Did he just say I was half leprechaun? Half Celtic fae I could handle, but little folk with pots of gold and rainbows? Not so much. Aaron, God love him, scratched the side of his head.
You're a leprechaun?
Killian's smile melted into a bland indifference.
Yes, but as you can see, the legends have it all wrong. We are not short, nor do we wear funny hats and green shorts, and we keep our gold in banks, not pots.
It had taken me a while to accept the fact I was a fairy who happened to shift into a flaming bird, but this would take some getting used to. Killian motioned in the general direction of my deflated baby bump.
You were pregnant in the photos on the website. Where's the child now?
I would very much like to meet him. And just like that, my suspicions formed an ice wall that would make Jon Snow and all of the Night's Watch drool with envy. No one, and I mean no one outside of the immediate family, went near my baby. Bryson, Aaron, and I had been warned Quinn was powerful, and that kind of magic would put him in danger. I don't think that's a good... Bryson interrupted me.
Exactly what sort of trouble is your father in, and why is it that Tessa is your last hope?
Before Killian could answer, my mother's little blue Prius came up the drive. Even from across the lawn, I could see the whites of her eyes as she stared, first at the Lamborghini and then at its owner. Hurricane Darlene was about to make landfall. Chapter 2. I hooked my arm in Killian's and pulled him to his feet. If we moved fast, I could get him into his fancy car before Darlene inserted herself into an already complicated situation. It's best if we continue this conversation another day. With all due respect, the circumstances are quite urgent. Killian turned and went wide-eyed. I couldn't blame the guy. Most folks had the same reaction the first time they saw Darlene in all her leopard print spandex glory. Bryson and Aaron exchanged glances. Though neither spoke, it didn't take a Ph.D. in male psychology to know they didn't give a crap about the situation or urgency. "Tessa Marie! You come back here and introduce your friend to your mama?" Darlene's voice hit a pitch that rivaled a cat with its tail under a lawnmower. "Mom?" Killian glanced from the charging woman to me. "Achilla is your mother, correct?" It's a long story. Until recently, Darlene thought I was her biological daughter. The doubt I had about Killian melted away a little more. Precious few people knew Darlene wasn't my biological mother, and fewer still knew my birth mother's name. Darlene stopped a couple of feet from us. Lips pursed, she took Killian in one slow inch at a time. Considering the man was as tall as Bryson, the appraisal bordered on obscene. When she glanced at me, she bugged her eyes. "Honestly, Tessa, where are your manners?" "Mama, this is Killian O'Rourke. Killian, this is Darlene, my mom." I had no desire to go any further down Introduction Road. For one, it had been a little over a week since she'd learned I wasn't the child she'd given birth to. I didn't know how she'd react to finding out he was probably my brother. "Killian!" She fanned herself and glanced away. The coy routine was so not Darlene. I had the feeling something was up. Something I was going to hate. He flashed her what I was quickly learning was his fake smile.
"It's a pleasure to meet you in person. You look exactly like I pictured."
In person? What he expected? What the heck? Aaron's expression went from curious to what I call his cop face, hard and blank.
"You two know each other?"
Darlene waved her hand and flubbed her lips. "We've spoken on the phone once or twice. I'd hardly say we know each other." Stone, my stoner stepfather, joined us with my baby brother in his arms. He glanced from his wife to Killian and back.
"Is this the guy you've been talking to day and night?"
My mother dipped her chin. I planted my hands on my hips and waited for someone to explain themselves. Stone said,
"Look, man, I practice a non-violent lifestyle, but I'm not stupid. What do you want with my wife?"
Killian looked my stepdad over, from his Grateful Dead t-shirt to his baggy jeans and Birkenstock sandals. Rather than addressing Stone, he turned to me.
"She introduced herself as your manager when I called the number on your website."
Aaron groaned. Bryson scowled. and I stood there unable to form a single syllable. Killian furrowed his brow, only this time he didn't try to hide his confusion. You know, the wonderful witcheredly world of Tessa Lamar. When Darlene had learned I wasn't her biological child, she'd handled it better than I'd expected. I mean, finding out that the baby you'd given birth to had died and your adopted uncle had switched your real daughter with his grandchild was traumatic. Learning said grandchild wasn't human could make anyone snap. Darlene, being Darlene, hadn't snapped. She'd sorted through the news and focused on what would benefit her, namely, the bit about me being a fairy. She'd glommed onto the idea that people would pay big bucks to consult with a real fairy. Thus, the wonderful witcheredly world of Tessa Lamar website had been born. What she'd failed to realize was that by putting my heritage and contact information on the internet, she'd given every wackadoo, human magic wielder, and psychopath a giant flashing neon arrow pointed at my house. Honestly, Tessa, I don't know why you're so mad. I thought you'd be thrilled to meet your brother. Darlene clung to Stone's arm. Not like a drowning woman holding on to a life preserver. This was more like a gladiator holding a shield. A human shield. I had no doubt she'd sacrifice him to save her own hide. Too bad for Stone, because I was about to rip her shellacked hair from her head. Someone called and claimed to be my brother, and you didn't think it was something you needed to tell me? She gave me a bless your dumb heart look. I didn't want you to be disappointed if he turned out to be full of baloney. How was I supposed to know he wasn't some loony from the internet? Aaron arched a brow.
Did you give him the address?
Not exactly. Darlene toed the ground like a scolded child. He saw it on the website. Stone, the most non-confrontational person I'd ever met, stepped away from Darlene.
You promised to take the website down.
Her lower lip quivered. I was going to, but with all of the drama and murders, and then the new grandbaby, I forgot.
When was the first time he called?
Stone wasn't having her excuses, which made me love the guy a little more. Darlene exaggerated a sigh. A few days before Quinn was born.
That was over a week ago.
Bryson shook his head. You've known about this an entire week? In a moment I can only describe as temporary insanity, I lunged for her. Thankfully, Aaron grabbed one side and Bryson grabbed the other. Between the two of them, they managed to keep me from serving a minimum of 16 years without the possibility of parole.
Whoa there, settle down. I'd hate to have to arrest the mother of my children.
Aaron chuckled, but it lacked his normal humor. Though he remained quiet, Bryson's calm, steady magic slid over me until the angry red haze lifted. For the life of me, I would never understand Darlene. Deep down, I thought she meant well, but her schemes caused me trouble on a regular basis. Case in point, that damned website. On the other hand, two potentially good things had come from the ordeal. A brother and a father. Killian stood a few feet away, watching the goings-on with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. It reminded me a bit of Aaron's cop face, only with a heaping helping of horror. I had no clue where he was from, but judging by his fancy car and clothes, he didn't rub elbows with country folk very often. He had to think he'd stumbled into a redneck nightmare. Then it hit me. They'd been talking for days. What about our so-called father? Where had Killian's sense of urgency been then? Lord in heaven, he could have gotten all sorts of information about me from Darlene. She could have blabbed all of my secrets, including Achila's name. I needed time and privacy to sort it all out. He might be fake, but that didn't mean he wasn't some loony from the internet, nor did it mean he was my brother. After drawing in a cleansing breath and exhaling nice and slow, I said, "Mama, you and Stone go to Grandma's. Tell her to serve dinner without us. We'll be in as soon as we say goodbye to Killian." "That's nonsense. He's obviously your brother. The least you can do is invite him for dinner." She made doe eyes at Killian. "You are her brother, right? You sure as heck don't dress like a psycho killer." I'm sure Ted Bundy's victims thought the same thing the first time they met him. I realized I'd insinuated my alleged brother was a serial killer the moment the words fell out of my mouth. Killian's expression turned as cold as the magic coursing through him, but it warmed when he glanced back to Darlene.
"I'd love to stay for dinner."
Thunder rolled overhead and dark clouds filled the bright blue Florida sky. Odd, considering the forecasters had called for a sunny day. I couldn't help but wonder if my alleged brother was monkeying with the weather in hopes of forcing me to invite him inside. Not freaking likely. Not tonight. In no mood to play games, I drew my spirit animal to the surface. Aaron was right. Brother or not, something was definitely off with the guy. The sooner I got him out of there, the better. Likely sensing my magic, Bryson and Aaron followed suit. One way or another, Killian O'Rourke was going to leave. My great-grandmother stepped out onto her front porch. "Tessa, I hate to interrupt, but I figured the coast was clear since Darlene and Stone didn't come in." The last thing I needed was for Grandma insisting on meeting Killian. She'd take one look at his Hollywood smile and bully him into staying for dinner.
"Go back inside, May."
Bryson spoke without taking his attention off me and Killian. Never one to follow orders, Grandma hurried down the steps and across the lawn before coming to a stop a few feet from us. "Killian, my goodness, is it really you? Chanoir?" He took a tentative step toward her, then another, and another. "It's been too long. 60 years. May choked out a sob and threw herself into his arms. "I thought I'd never see you again." I had no idea what he'd called her, but it was obviously a term of endearment. Stone tilted his head.
"May's your grandmother?"
"Since when do you speak?" Darlene waved her hand. "Whatever it was he just spoke."
"It's Gaelic. Chanoir means grandma."
Stone furrowed his brow.
"But 60 years? The guy doesn't look a day over 25.
It took some mental gymnastics, but my brain managed to pull off a double round-off twist and land on the truth. My God, he's really my brother. Darlene barked out a laugh. "I told you so." She gave Stone side-eye. "And it looks like I'm not the only one who's been keeping secrets." Chapter 3. The 1,062 questions I had for Killian had grown exponentially. Heck, I had about the same number for my Grandma. She'd obviously known about my brother. It wasn't a stretch to imagine she'd known my father's identity all along. The fact she hadn't shared the information with me, even though I'd asked at various points in my life, hurt like battery acid on road rash. Grandma pulled back from Killian and gave me a sheepish smile. "The three of us should talk." "You think?" Biting my tongue to keep from sassing her, I nodded. Darlene cleared her throat. "Don't you mean the four of us? I'm the one who found him. I should be included in the conversation." Grandma raised her chin. I said 3, and I meant it. Everyone else go inside and eat. Ribs taste like rubber when they're warmed over in the microwave." Darlene smirked. "How would you know? You use your microwave like a bread box." May shot her a look that'd scare a buzzard off of roadkill and led Killian toward my house. Bryson rested his hand on the small of my back and leaned close.
"Do you want me to come with you?"
Not trusting my voice, I shook my head. The frown he'd worn since Killian had arrived deepened. I thanked my lucky stars he didn't argue, but something told me it was coming. Aaron, on the other hand, had plenty to say. He moved to my other side and didn't bother to whisper,
"I'm going with you. None of this adds up. He should have told you he'd talked to Darlene and that he knew May when he first drove up."
"I'll be fine." I forced a smile and willed him to listen to reason. "Go eat. This is supposed to be a welcome home party for Tank." Darlene looped her arm in Aaron's. "Come on, handsome. Tessa's a big girl. She can handle herself." That she'd taken my side surprised me. I opened my mouth to thank her, but she cut me off. "Besides, we'll be close enough to hear her scream if something goes wrong." She laughed high and shrill. I suppressed a groan. "Thanks, Mama."
"Darlene, we're not done talking."
Stone gave Killian a disgusted look and hurried after my mom and Aaron. Bryson leaned in and whispered,
"I'm with Aaron. Something is off. Be careful."
Great. One of them I could dismiss as overprotective paranoia. Both of them, having the same spidey sense, made my pulse race. I'll listen to what he has to say and send him on his way. Be there before dessert. His lips curled in a ghost of a grin.
"Mind if I check in with you in a bit?"
"That's fine, as long as you bring us some food. I've been smelling barbecue all day. I'm starved." As if on cue, my Aunt Dottie poked her head out the screen door. "Everything all right out there? Buck Oldham's truck is coming down the road." "Yes, ma'am. Everything's fine. I'll send Buck in." I prayed she'd take my words for it and go back inside. I didn't think my heart could handle it if I found out she'd been lying to me, too. "Why are your friend and May heading in the wrong direction? Didn't you invite him for dinner?" She made her way down the porch steps. Killian stopped outside my front door and waved at the elderly lady, as if greeting an old friend. Dottie gasped, pressed her hand to her chest, and darted back inside. Bryson glanced at me as if expecting an explanation for her strange behavior. Maybe she knows him too. I glanced back toward my brother.
"Maybe."
He gave me the same sort of look folks gave grieving family members at funerals. The facial expression equivalent to, "I know you're in pain, but I have no idea how to help."
"Go on in. I'll wait for Buck."
"Thanks." I turned and headed across the yard. Buck Oldham was the chief of the local Cherokee tribe and one of my grandfather's closest friends. After I'd come into my powers, Buck hadn't been my biggest fan. He'd come around eventually, and I'd forgiven his shenanigans. After all, had it not been for Buck insisting Bryson become my bodyguard, we never would have met. It wasn't that I had anything against the guy, but I never knew which Buck we'd get. He could be as sweet as Grandma's iced tea or as cantankerous as a rattlesnake with a toothache. I stopped and waved to the weathered old man as he stepped out of his equally weathered old truck.
"Is dinner at your place?"
Eyes wide and his mouth set in a hard line, Buck stared past me to Killian on the stairs. He seemed to take an instant disliking to my new brother. Bryson jogged to his side.
"We're at May's. Tessa had some unexpected company.
Buck shot me a weird look before nodding and following Bryson. In no hurry to face my great-grandmother, I watched the men until they disappeared into the little pink house. Walking through my front door felt like going to the dentist. I knew I'd leave with what I needed, but eventually the numbness would wear off and it'd hurt like hell. The man who had answers to my lifelong questions stood next to the woman who'd been lying to me since birth. Killian was a stranger, but Graham May? I thought we'd aired out all of the family secrets after I shifted into the Firebird for the first time. Apparently not.
This is my nephew?
Killian turned from a newly framed photo of my newborn son. It was one of those horrible baby mugshots they insist on taking in the hospital. Quinn resembled a pink raisin in a blue crocheted cap, but I loved it just the same. Yep, it was taken a few days ago. I felt like Pandora about to open the box with the secrets of the universe inside. Let's hope this turns out better for me than it did for her.
What do you call him?
He motioned to the photo. Graham May's expression brightened. Quincy Emmett Charles, or Quinn for short. Hearing his name made me miss him. Not to mention my boobs felt heavy. If I didn't speed things along, I'd have to take a mid-conversation nursing break.
A strong Celtic name. Quinn means an intelligent, wise leader.
He glanced back at the picture. May named him. I stared at my great-grandmother with a growing sense of suspicion. She'd helped Aaron and Bryson pick out the name. Charles after my grandfather, Emmett after Bryson's father, and Quincy after Aaron's dad. But I couldn't help but wonder if she'd suggested Quinn as a nickname for another reason.
I'd like to meet him,
Killian said. As much as I would have loved to have my son in my arms, my husband's warnings that something wasn't quite right danced through my head. You'd have to wrestle him away from his fathers. Graham May shot to her feet. I'll go get him. No! I spoke louder than I'd intended and backtracked. We have things to discuss first. Of course. Killian gave me a wistful smile.
He's a lucky boy to have such a large family. There aren't many O'Rourkes left, I'm afraid.
The weight of his words hit me in the chest. No, not his words. His emotions. Then again, that didn't seem right either. Something about the way he expressed himself seemed rehearsed. I'm sorry to hear that. He waved me off with a flick of his hands.
Like humans, the Fae have experienced their fair share of war. It's all ancient history.
I had more important things to discuss than the history of the Ishi. Unfortunately, I wasn't the only one with questions. He pointed to a candid shot of Bryson and Aaron with Jolene sandwiched in between.
And the girl. Who is she?
That's Jolene. She's Aaron's biological daughter, but Bryson and I think of her as our own. He seemed surprised by my declaration.
Is she Fae too?
No. I didn't know him well enough to get into JoJo's past. Not too long ago, she'd witnessed her mother's murder and been haunted by a teenaged spirit, and that was just the start of the girl's troubles. Though she was human, she had the ability to not only speak to ghosts, but to control them.
Her eyes look Fae in this photo.
I had no idea what he was talking about. She had Aaron's Caribbean blue eyes. They were an unusual color, but I'd seen it before, hadn't I?
Is she with the woman in the pink house? She's your grandmother?
Killian seemed to choose his words carefully. Yes, but I call her Aunt Dottie. I wondered how much, if anything, Killian and our dad knew about the adopted side of my family tree. He'd seemed surprised to learn I called Darlene Mama, but he didn't question me referring to May as my great-grandmother. It had broken my heart when I'd found out I wasn't related to May and the zillion or so cousins I'd grown up with. But I'd since learned it took more than genetics to make a family.
Right. Dottie. The human who married Achila's father.
He nodded to himself.
But you call her your aunt.
Tessa grew up believing Charlie was her uncle. She only learned he was her grandfather 3 years ago. May sat on the sofa and seemed to avoid my gaze. I grew up believing a lot of things that weren't true. The words fell out of my mouth before I could stop them. What could I say? I was hurt with a side order of angry. Grandma hung her head. Killian continued the conversation as if oblivious to the tension between me and Grandma.
I don't think I'll ever get used to hearing him referred to as Charlie.
I felt like I was attending someone else's family reunion. You knew him? Killian tilted his head and grinned.
Yes, but to me, he was Chisiqua of the Red Paint clan, my Shanaher.
I was fairly certain I'd never heard the word, but it seemed familiar to me somehow. Your what?
My grandfather.
I held up a hand to buy a second or two. When he'd introduced himself as my brother, for some reason I'd assumed he meant half-brother. He watched me with a curious expression.
You did not realize we shared a mother as well as a father?
No, I didn't. I guess I should have asked, but I jumped to the wrong conclusion when I felt your magic. I found myself envying Killian for knowing both of our parents when I'd grown up without either. As if she'd read my mind, May curled her shoulders forward. Guilty consciences could do that. Killian glanced between us.
Forgive me. I can see I've made you both uncomfortable.
Rather than outright lying, I shook my head. It's not your fault we were dealt very different hands. He turned to me.
Don't envy me, Tessa. I would have preferred to grow up here with our grandfather. He must have been an amazing teacher for you to have both fire and air magic.
Oh, he never... I didn't quite know how to break it to him that Charlie had died before he'd gotten around to telling me I was Fae, let alone teaching me anything about my magic. Thankfully, May had no such problem. Killian, Charlie bound most of Tessa's magic at birth to keep her safe. He whipped his head in my direction. His expression morphed into something between shock and horror.
But you aren't bound now.
No. I felt like I'd woken up in the Twilight Zone. Grandma hadn't bothered to tell me my grandfather had locked away my magic. I'd seen spirits my entire life, but the rest had appeared after I'd taken a shotgun blast to the chest, died, and risen as a firebird. The spell failed after his death. May wrung her hands. Thank goodness Bryson came along and helped her learn to control it.
Bryson?
Killian scoffed.
His abilities are primitive at best.
I'd heard enough for one day. It was one thing to show up and implode my world. It was another to insult the one man who'd helped me when no one else could. Excuse me? Killian seemed to realize he'd overstepped.
Forgive me. I didn't mean to insult anyone.
Then what did you mean to do? He glanced at May as if he thought she could save him. When she didn't, he sighed.
The wards outside and the silencing spell are rudimentary. A child in Tiernan could do more.
I sat too stunned to speak, let alone process what he'd said. Up until a month ago, Bryson and I thought we were the only two Fae on the planet. Maybe we weren't as powerful as the folks in Tirna wherever he said he was from, but at least we weren't judgmental a-holes. Killian closed the distance between us and took my hands in his.
I've made a mistake. It was wonderful meeting you, Tessa, but you can't help me. I should go.
He was a stranger, but he'd managed to poke 2 of my buttons. Hell, he might as well have waved a red cape in front of a bull. First of all, I hated, absolutely positively loathed, when someone underestimated me. Killian Fancy Pants O'Rourke didn't know squat about me or my magic. He had no way to know what I was, or was not, capable of. Second, there was no way in hell I was letting him go without telling me what was going on with our father. Sure, I had more baggage than a transatlantic cruise liner, but the thought that he'd leave before I learned anything about my dad paralyzed me. Now you just wait a second. I jerked my hands back. You're not going anywhere until you tell me where our dad is and what kind of trouble he's in. Chapter 4. It might have been a sin, but I enjoyed Killian's shocked expression. Call me an optimist, but I doubted he'd underestimate me again. What I might or might not have lacked in magic, I made up for with determination. Laughing, Grandma pushed to her feet.
You might want to do as she says. We might be primitive around here, but we aren't afraid of kicking some fairy backside.
Killian's shoulders sagged, but he didn't make a run for it. I considered that a win. Grandma squeezed my arm.
I owe you an apology and an explanation, but those will wait until you are done here.
I nodded and waited until she left before turning my attention back to my brother. Motioning to the spot May had vacated, I said, "Have a seat and tell me what kind of trouble our father is in." Killian stared at the worn and slightly lumpy sofa as if it were a steaming pile of poo before perching on the edge of the cushion. I felt like the country mouse meeting her city cousin for the first time. Or, in my case, fairy brother. However, I refused to make excuses or apologize for the way we lived. Bryson had plenty of money, and Aaron and I had respectable jobs. We might not be part of a royal court, but we had a good life. Holding my head high, I said, "Neither of us will know if I can help until you tell me what's going on."
You're right.
His arrogance seemed to melt away, leaving behind a vulnerability I hadn't seen, except when he'd hugged Grandma.
Liam, Dad, is a bit of a gambler, a common habit among the Leprechaun clan.
Once again, Killian seemed to choose his words with care. Outside of the one on the cereal box, I knew absolutely nothing about leprechauns. Rather than asking questions and risk him going off on a tangent, I nodded.
There was the bet, and it looks like he'll serve 100 years as the Queen's manservant.
His face twisted in disgust.
His only hope of freedom is to escape to the human world.
Okay. I don't know what I'd expected him to say, but that wasn't it. Is this the same queen that you work for?
Creve. Yes.
He spoke her name as if it were a curse word. 100 years of slavery seems like a ridiculous thing to risk in a bet. Sure, Fae had much longer lifespans than humans, but I'd never really put a number to it.
You'd be surprised what some people will wager.
He sounded as though he spoke from personal experience. While I would have loved to hear his story, now that I had him talking about our father, I needed to keep him on track. Where is our dad now?
In Tirnanook.
Killian must have picked up on my confusion because he added,
It's a land in another dimension.
Like the spirit world? I had some experience traveling beyond the veil, but it wasn't the kind of place I'd book a summer vacation. It was more of a monster-inhabited rest stop for wayward spirits on the highway to heaven or hell. He tilted his head.
I'm not familiar with the term, but I believe you're referring to the unseen layer of this world. Tirnanog is a separate place.
The explanation did nothing to help me understand. If anything, it created even more questions. One problem at a time, Tessa. If this Quiva, I stressed each syllable. If the queen wouldn't lay him in a bed, why would she harm him? Wouldn't that be like flushing her winnings down the toilet? He cringed, likely at my word choice.
It's complicated.
Try me.
Fae rulers have the ultimate authority in Tirnanog. They have a say in everything, including who lives and who dies.
Once again, he seemed to have cherry-picked his words. I had the feeling he was tap-dancing around the real problem, but I didn't have enough information to read between the lines. What aren't you telling me?
Dad and Quiva have a long, unpleasant history.
Killian lowered his gaze. I was sick and tired of his evasiveness. Rather than prompting him with another question, I waited for him to continue. Killian shifted his weight, glanced at me, and sighed.
Let's just say you don't jilt a monarch and get away with it.
Sounds like one of Grandma's soap operas. While I was certain there was much more to the story, I decided to let it go. For the moment, anyway. Why am I the only one who can help him escape?
Only blood relations may enter his chambers without permission from the Queen.
He leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees.
I'm too well known at court. Quiva's guards watch my every move. They would arrest me the second I opened a portal. I'd hoped you could slip in unnoticed and bring him out.
I hated to disappoint him almost as much as I hated to admit he was right about me not being the right person for the job. Killian, I'm sorry, but I don't know a thing about opening portals or royal courts or the Fae, for that matter. Other than having the right DNA, I'm no help to you.
I could teach you the magic and the court protocols.
He sighed.
But I'm afraid it's more complicated than that. Your accent will draw too much attention. The moment you spoke, they would know you were from the human world.
My twang had been the cause of more than one problem. People heard it and automatically made assumptions about me and my intelligence. Still, I had to do something. This was my father we were talking about. If some evil queen had enslaved him, I wanted to help him escape. What if I pretended to be mute? Or got a voice coach?
I'm afraid there isn't time for that.
A hint of doubt about him returned. You've been talking to Darlene. I'm surprised you didn't think I'd have an accent.
I wasn't sure how close the two of you were. She claimed to be your manager.
He flashed me his Hollywood smile.
And I wanted to meet my little sister.
Bryson came through the door, carrying 2 plates piled high with ribs, potato salad, baked beans, and homemade rolls.
Sorry to interrupt. I thought you two might be hungry.
Aaron followed him in with Quinn in his arms.
And someone wants his mommy. Not only does he have your nose, he inherited your hangriness.
That he'd brought the baby when Killian was still there surprised me. I had no idea what had changed Aaron's attitude, but my money was on Grandma. I stood and took Quinn from his arms. The second his sweet baby smell hit me, I knew I had a problem. A big one. There was no way in this world or Tiernan Oak I was going to pull a Darlene and leave Quinn to go on some adventure. Not to mention, Killian's plan sounded as dangerous as skinny dipping in a hot tub full of water moccasins. I wouldn't risk the little guy growing up without a mother. Killian kept his distance, but his gaze never left the baby. Bryson, would you mind setting the table while I nurse Quinn? I was new to the breastfeeding thing and couldn't help but feel self-conscious. Killian shot to his feet as if I'd zapped him.
No need. I should be going. But I would be honored if you'd allow me to hold my nephew for a few moments. Babies are rare in Tiernan Oak. Until recently, I believed you were the last Fae born.
My poor overstimulated brain couldn't handle any more new information, nor could I make sense of my jumbled thoughts enough to ask any more questions. Oh! Quinn's unhappy noises morphed into a full-blown wail. Would you mind if we finished this conversation after he has a full belly? I brought the infant to my shoulder and rocked back and forth in hopes of soothing him.
Here, let me help.
Killian moved to my side and rested his hand on Quinn's back. The baby quieted instantly. The little booger even turned in his new uncle's direction and struggled to hold his head up, as if trying to get a better look. I stood dumbstruck. Did you bespell him? Grinning like an idiot, Killian bent down until he was eye level with Quinn.
No, not exactly. Then what exactly?
Bryson stepped forward as if to shield his family from the newcomer. Between his size and his touch him again and I'll strangle you with your own intestines expression, most people would have cowered. Evidently, Killian wasn't most people.
Relax.
Killian chuckled and made a goofy face at Quinn.
I took a little of my magic when I touched him. He's starving for it. Why do you three keep your power under lock and key?
Starving for magic? Is he kidding? I moved closer to Bryson to put some distance between Quinn and Killian. We're raising him like any other child. My brother's eyes widened.
You mean like any other human child?
I didn't care for the way he was staring at us like we were imbeciles. In case you missed it, we live here, in the human world.
But he's Fae. He needs magic as much as he needs food, shelter, and love. It's how we learn to use our gifts. Without it, his power will wither and eventually fade.
Bryson and Aaron looked Killian over each in their own way. Bryson with a stoic curiosity, and Aaron with a just-the-facts ma'am detective's eye. Is that a bad thing? My voice came out shakier than I would have liked. I hated the idea of withholding something Quinn needed, but more than anything, I wanted him to grow up differently than I had, seeing spirits, never quite fitting in, feeling like a weirdo.
Maybe it is.
Aaron nodded at Quinn.
That's the quietest he's been all day.
That he'd even contemplate feeding our son magic shocked me. Aaron was human. The only reason he had any gifts at all was because Bryson had given him a piece of his soul to save his life. I'd had about enough of the conversation. Quinn is half Fae, and we'll raise him as we see fit.
Half?
Killian glanced between my hubbies and pressed his lips together. What the heck was that about?
Forgive me. I didn't mean to overstep my bounds. I should go. I have things to attend to at home.
Killian gave Quinn one last longing look before turning to leave. Wait, you're leaving? We haven't had much time to talk, and there's food. Are you hungry? The idea of him disappearing with no way to contact him gave me a case of verbal diarrhea. How can I reach you? I need your number. You live in Tiernan Oak, right? Do cell phones even work there? I'll be in touch." He made a zigzag pattern with his hand, and the room filled with a bluish-tinged light. When it dimmed, he was gone, and Quinn started crying. Chapter 5. Aaron hurried to the window.
"Well, I'll be damned. He left his car here. I'm not sure where to even begin."
Bryson sank onto the couch. At least one of my hubbies seemed more concerned with what had just happened than the Lamborghini. I plopped down in my easy chair to nurse Quinn. I meant what I said. I want this little guy to have a chance to grow up like a normal kid. Bryson nodded. Aaron rolled his lips in, a sure sign he disagreed.
As the only human in the room, I'll play the devil's advocate. You see magic as a burden. I see it as an asset. Besides, do we really want to deprive our son of something he needs?
I opened my mouth to argue, but Bryson set his hand on my thigh and shook his head.
Actually, you're both right, but I'm not sure it's as cut and dry as Killian made it sound.
Bryson glanced between us.
I grew up surrounded by magic, but Tessa didn't.
Aaron motioned to me.
She had Charlie, and she's been able to speak to spirits since childhood.
I hated when they talked about me as if I wasn't in the room, especially when they didn't know what the heck they were talking about. Actually, I was with Darlene and her third husband in Tallahassee until I was 2.
But you never lost your magic.
Aaron paced like a lawyer on a bad TV drama.
Exactly my point. I don't think his magic will fade as quickly as Killian made it seem.
Bryson leaned down and kissed the baby's head.
I'd rather find a way to keep his gifts under control until he's old enough to make this decision for himself. I can get behind that.
Aaron flashed us a grin and turned his attention back to the flashy car in the driveway. I wanted to point out that I had to take a bullet to the heart for my magic to roar to life, but I didn't want to give Aaron more ammunition. I need to summon Charlie. I'll ask him about Quinn's magic after I get some answers about Killian and my dad. Bryson took the sleeping baby from my arms.
Eat something first. I'll take care of Quinn.
I won't be able to stomach food until I talk to Charlie. I headed into the office Bryson and I used when members of the tribe would stop by for healings. We'd put an end to the visits before Quinn was born. I'd focused on my work at the police department, and Bryson had opened a shop at the tribal house. But we'd kept the office intact for emergencies. Maddie, our chocolate lab, and arguably the dumbest dog in the history of dumb dogs, had claimed the room. She was curled up in her bed but hopped to her feet when I walked into the office. Her tongue hanging out one side of her mouth, she tilted her head and burped. "Excuse you," I wrinkled my nose. Maddie rolled onto her back. Arms and legs in the air like a dead cockroach, she wiggled around making pig sounds. I had 2 choices: toss her into the hall and risk her scratching and whining at the door, or let her stay and risk her distracting me during the summoning. I let her stay. Worst case scenario, she'd make enough racket to alert Bryson if something or someone besides Charlie crossed the veil. I pulled a jar of salt down from the top shelf and got to work. After drawing a 4 feet wide circle with the salt, I grabbed Charlie's notebook of spells from the drawer and settled into the center of the circle. I could have done things the easy way and called out his name in the hopes he'd appear. However, easy didn't come with a guarantee. I didn't have time to sit around and wait. We had things to discuss, and dang it, I didn't want to take a chance on him ignoring me. Lowering my shields, I let my magic flow through the room and called on the 5 elements: earth, water, fire, air, and spirit. I felt rather than saw the magical circle snap into place. It wouldn't keep my power contained, but it would keep anything that came over from the other side of the veil trapped inside with me. I closed my eyes and chanted, "Charles Nokaseka, your blood calls to you. Come into this circle. Charles Nokaseka, hear my plea. Come." I chanted the summoning a dozen more times, but nothing happened. On the verge of giving up, I raised my hands and formed an image of the thick, inky veil that separated the physical and spirit worlds. "Charlie, please, I need to talk to you. Come." Maddie jumped up from her bed and growled deep in her throat. A ridge of fur stood upright like a shark fin between her shoulder blades, but she hadn't barked. I took that as a good sign.
"Hell, girl, long time no see."
Gavin Partridge's spirit materialized in front of me. Sitting cross-legged, he floated a few inches off the ground. "Gavin!" I threw my arms around him, or tried to. They went right through him. He laughed his stage performer's laugh, loud and flamboyant.
"Easy there, sugar. I'm not tied to this world anymore. It'll take me a smidge to solidify."
I'd met Gavin after he had been murdered by a crazed ex-lover who just happened to have ties to the Las Vegas Mafia. He'd haunted me day and night until I'd agreed to help him. Together with Aaron and Bryson, we'd put the Christmas killer and his associates away for a very long time and freed Gavin's spirit. Maddie edged closer, sniffed the circle, and returned to her bed. "Why are you here?" I didn't mean to sound ungrateful, but I'd called Charlie.
"Your grandfather sent me."
Gavin motioned to the ceiling.
"He's a little busy, but he sends his regards."
"Sends his regards? Is he serious?" "It's really good to see you, but I need to speak to Charlie or Achila." I hated the whine in my voice, but Gavin had a way of bringing out the worst in me.
"I know more than you might think about your predicament."
Gavin motioned to my curls. "Do that thing with your hair and I'll dish." I didn't have time to put on a dog and flaming pony show. I needed to get some answers before Quinn's next feeding. "If you know as much as you say you do, then you know I need answers." He raised his brows and pressed his lips together. "Fine." I drew the firebird to the surface enough that the tips of my hair and my pupils turned to flames. The trick had earned me the cringe-worthy nickname when we'd first met. Gavin wrapped his arms around his middle and laughed.
"Oh, hell, girl, I've missed you."
"Stop calling me that." I swatted him, and this time I made contact for a split second before my hand slid through him. "Does Charlie know anything about my father?"
"Straight to the point. Some things never change."
Gavin sobered.
"Liam is in Tirnanoke. He's not allowed to leave because of a bet."
Killian had told me that much. I needed to ask better questions. Spirits, even the familiar ones, tended to take things literally, like they lost all sense of nuance after they died. "How do I get him out?" Gavin's game show host smile faded.
"You can't. Not until the bet is finished."
"That's 100 years." He didn't reply. I threw up my hands and groaned. "I give up. You tell me what I need to know."
"Thought you'd never ask."
Gavin tapped a finger to his chin.
"Let's see. Charlie said to tell you things are not always as they seem. You're never truly alone. Last, but not least, lies can be the truth, and the truth can be a lie."
I wanted to strangle him, but that would have been bad for many reasons. First off, I didn't think he was solid enough to choke. Secondly, he'd died by strangulation with a set of Christmas lights. Somehow, I didn't think he'd appreciate a repeat performance. "That's it?" I shook my head. Nothing about my dad having a queen for a stalker, or why Charlie bound my magic, or if we're depriving our child?
Nope.
Gavin frowned and leaned closer, as if to share a secret.
Your grandfather's a great guy, but he's not much of a talker.
Thanks for coming. It was great seeing you again, but we're done here. I shot to my feet. Don't be a stranger. Gavin's mouth fell open and he pressed his hand to his chest in mock indignation.
I've come all this way and you're not even going to introduce me to your children.
I hung my head. He lifted my chin, and when I met his gaze, all of the humor had left his expression.
Tessa, you and yours are in a world of trouble. I promised you I'd come back if you ever needed me, and make no mistake about it, Hell Girl, you need me.
I wasn't buying it. What kind of trouble? I had the spirit trapped inside the circle, and I didn't intend to let him go until he started talking.
I can't say.
Gavin turned to go and slammed against the magical wall, keeping him where I wanted him. Why? My gaze fell on Charlie's notebook. I had half a mind to thumb through it for a truth spell, but I doubted I'd find anything that would work on a ghost. He sighed the sigh parents had been using since children were invented.
I can't tell you that either. There are rules.
What kind of rules? I'd been talking to spirits since I was a child, and this was the first I'd ever heard of such a thing.
You're going to have to trust me.
He pressed his spectral hands against the barrier like a mime, only this was no imaginary box.
There'll be hell to pay if I break them. Real hell. Not just flaming hair and glowing eyes.
I wanted to pitch a hissy fit, but I doubted it'd do any good. Gavin, for all of his faults, was a good guy and a friend. If he said he couldn't tell me what was going on, he had his reasons. Charlie sent you to help me?
Yes.
Gavin glanced over his shoulder.
But I can't do much inside this bubble.
I smeared the salt line, breaking the circle. How do you intend to help me when you can't tell me what's going on? He stepped over the salt, smoothed his linen jacket and slacks, and ran a hand through his hair.
Simple. I'll be your Jiminy Cricket.
My what? I'd grown up near Orlando. Disney was a part of our culture. I knew the cartoon character, but I didn't understand the reference.
The angel on your shoulder. Your conscience.
Gavin moved his hands in a small circle.
Your dead life coach. Your ghostest with the mostest.
I felt a migraine coming on. Pressing my fingers into my temples, I asked, "And how do you propose to do that?"
You and I will be joined together like Peter Pan and his shadow.
I wasn't impressed with the notion or his analogy. Peter had to sew his shadow to himself to keep it from running away. Gavin tapped his chin, as if trying to think of a better example.
Fine. I'll follow you around and make sure you don't do anything to make matters worse.
I could barely manage to get through a day with my sanity as it was. A couple hours of Gavin following me around, and I'd break out in stress hives. Plus, Jolene could see spirits. She'd only recently stopped talking to ghosts in public. Being a preteen was hard enough. She didn't need people thinking she was nuts, too. Then there were the guys to think about. And Quinn. Absolutely not. I shook my head. Not going to happen.
Relax. You won't even know I'm here.
He batted his lashes. Uh-huh. You're not exactly subtle or used to staying in the background. Gavin sighed and folded his arms.
I'm not going anywhere, so you may as well get used to the idea of having a house guest.
Mom? Jolene knocked on the office door. Are you okay in there? Maddie raised her head, glanced from me to the door and finally to Gavin. "I'll be right there." My voice came out on the wrong side of hysterical. The last thing I needed was for her to catch me summoning a spirit when we'd forbidden her from doing the same thing. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Something in her tone made the hair on the back of my neck stand at attention. "Be right there." I kicked the salt under the bed and dresser and motioned like a wild woman for Gavin to disappear. Jojo turned the doorknob. "Why do you sound weird? Are you okay?" The ghost glanced around the room and did a double take at the chocolate lab curled up in her dog bed. "I'll be close." "What do you mean?" I had a feeling I wasn't going to like Gavin's answer. "Who's in there with you?" She rattled the knob. "I can feel your magic. Are you talking to a spirit?" Shit. I gave Gavin one last pleading look, crossed the room and threw the door open. "Just finishing up a spell." He vanished. The dog half howled and half yipped before curling up again. I glanced back at Maddie and opened the door. Jojo did a quick sweep of the room. "What kind of spell?" I was asking for patience and help with the baby. I hadn't lied. Not outright. She rolled her eyes. "That's praying." "Right. Sort of." I drew a breath and reminded myself I was smarter than a 10-year-old. "What did you need to talk to me about?" "I forgot." She shrugged and walked out of the room. Chapter 6. 3 days had gone by, and whatever trouble was coming for us had yet to arrive. Unless Gavin was talking about family drama, that I had in spades. Other than to eat and nap, Quinn hadn't stopped crying. Sleep was something that happened to other people. Grandma and I had been avoiding each other. Neither of us seemed eager to have that heart-to-heart conversation. In short, running off to Tiernan Oak didn't sound like such a bad idea. Worst still, I hadn't heard a peep from Killian or the spirit who'd sworn to stay close. Not that I minded. Aaron and Bryson had mixed feelings about Gavin Partridge standing in for Charlie like a second-string quarterback. I stared out the kitchen window and went through the motions of doing the breakfast dishes. Lately, I spent most of my time on autopilot, barely aware of the goings-on around me. Case in point, I was vaguely aware of Aaron pacing the room while he spoke on the phone.
Right, but that's 3 murders in as many days.
Aaron dropped into a kitchen chair. The word murders caught my attention. He had to be talking to Samuels, his partner. Before Quinn had been born, we'd agreed Aaron, Bryson, and I would take an extended maternity leave. In my mind, that meant Aaron would have more than a week and a half off work.
Keep me informed. Any word on the other matter?
He went quiet, only replying with the occasional mm-hms and uh-huhs. "Mom, I remembered what I was going to tell you the other day," Jolene whisper shouted from the doorway. "I need cookies for the youth group bake sale." I assumed she was attempting to be quiet because her father was on a call. Unlike my daughter, I didn't give a rat's backside about interrupting Aaron. "Homemade or store-bought?" "Homemade, please." Maddie rushed into the room and glanced around as if looking for said cookies. When she realized there were no treats to be had, she made a disgruntled sound and climbed into the chair next to Jojo. Sitting upright with her paws on the table like a person, she flashed me a doggy grin. "Get down from there." I pointed at the floor. The dog rolled her eyes, jumped down, and curled up at Jojo's feet.
I'll be in touch.
Aaron slammed his cell phone on the dining room table.
Son of a...
He shot Jojo a guilty look before turning to me.
That shiny red sports car Killian left in our driveway?
The soapy plate slipped from my hand, and I hung my head. Let me guess. It's not registered to a Killian O'Rourke? The dog growled. Great. Even Maddie has an issue with my new brother.
Nope. It belongs to a movie mogul. The last time he saw it was in a garage in Miami.
Aaron stood and moved to my side.
That's not the worst part.
I didn't want to ask. I really didn't. I'd had enough worst parts to last me a lifetime. What is?
I've spoken to everyone from the FBI to Interpol. Killian O'Rourke doesn't exist.
Aaron went on about his law enforcement contacts and how he had no idea how to explain the stolen car out front, but I tuned him out. It made sense that a fae who lived in another dimension wouldn't have a record in the human world. However, it didn't excuse the fact Killian was a thief. A thief who'd left his expensive Italian mess for me to clean up. Jolene backed out of the kitchen without a word. I'd noticed her tiptoeing around the grown-ups a lot lately. Not that I blamed her. We were all one crisis away from a breakdown. Thankfully, Maddie followed her.
I mean it, Tessa. I don't care who he is. His four-leaf clover loving ass isn't welcome here.
Aaron paced the kitchen.
On second thought, if he ever contacts you again, invite him over so I can arrest him.
Rather than comment, I turned my attention back to the pile of dirty breakfast dishes. This wasn't the first time I'd heard Aaron's opinion about my brother. Bryson, Aaron, and I hadn't stopped debating what to do about Killian since he'd vanished from our living room. Between our arguing and Quinn's colic, it was no wonder we'd turned into sleep-deprived zombies. Aaron's foul mood had as much to do with the stress inside the house as Killian, but I wasn't about to point that out. I nodded toward the hall where Jolene had slipped away. Could you spend a little time with JoJo today? I'm worried about her. She's been talking to the dog like Maddie's her only friend. His scowl melted into a frown.
I'll try. But I need to do some research on a case Samuels is working on. Possible serial killer.
The thread holding my sanity snapped. Oh, no, you don't, mister. We're on maternity leave. The only crazy lunatic you need to focus on is me.
I know, but this one is...
I pressed my hands to my ears and sung Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf. Childish? You bet. But I had no intention of getting sucked into the gory details of a murder investigation. Aaron folded his arms and waited for me to stop. The second I dropped my hands, he said,
Funny you should mention wolves. One of the victims was allegedly attacked by a wolf.
That got my attention. Then why does Samuels think it's a serial killer? His grin told me he knew he had me.
In each of the cases, witnesses reported seeing the victim speaking to a tall, dark-haired man moments before the animal attacked.
I'm not following you. What does the dark-haired guy have to do with the wolves? He shrugged.
That's what we're trying to figure out. The witnesses saw the animal attacks, but we haven't recovered any remains to verify the causes of death.
That's disturbing, but I'm sure Samuels can handle the case. I turned back to the sink. When were you going to tell me you ran a background check on Killian? Aaron sighed and moved behind me. Massaging my shoulders, he whispered,
I didn't want to upset you. I was hoping there wouldn't be anything to report.
As good as his fingers felt, pressing into my tight muscles, I jerked away. So, you weren't going to tell me at all? He's my brother. You should have discussed it with me.
Would you have told me not to look into him?
I opened my mouth to answer, but snapped it shut. I had no idea what to say. My feelings about Killian ranged from never wanting to see him again to hoping he'd return with a better plan to rescue our father. Bryson joined us in the kitchen with a crying baby on his shoulder.
Tessa, why aren't you ready to go?
Dang it! I'd forgotten about Quinn's pediatrician appointment, but I wasn't about to admit it. Instead, I motioned to my clothing with a soapy hand. I am ready to go. You were taking forever, so I decided to do the dishes. He glanced from my worn-out yoga pants to the oversized t-shirt I'd practically lived in during the last trimester of my pregnancy to my frizzy red curls.
Right. We should leave, or we're going to hit I-4 traffic.
I could have pointed out that once upon a time before Quinn was born, he would have told me I was beautiful no matter what I had on. Or the fact that until that moment, he hadn't as much as looked at me in the past week. Or that despite the fact I'd given birth, died, and risen from the dead as a firebird, I was still hormonal. Instead, I grabbed my purse and marched to the living room. Quinn stopped screaming long enough to spit up all over the front of Bryson's black button-up. The big guy glanced down, shook his head, and headed for the bedroom, muttering Cherokee curses the entire way. Aaron trailed behind me.
I mean it, Tessa. He's not welcome here. Grand Theft Auto is serious business.
I heard you the first time, Cranky McCrankster. I swung the front door open to find Graham May on the doorstep with her hand raised as if to knock. Sorry, I didn't hear you out there. She pressed her hand to her chest.
My goodness, child. You scared the daylights out of me.
Aaron rounded the corner. Evidently, he didn't see Graham May standing there. Or he didn't care, because he continued his mini tirade.
Since when do we call each other names in this house? And for the record, I am not cranky.
Graham May arched an eyebrow.
You sure about that? You're acting like someone licked the red off your candy.
Aaron had the good sense to dip his chin and glance away.
Mm-hmm. That's what I thought.
Shaking her head, she walked into the house, glanced around at the mess, and frowned.
Tank called. He's coming by to talk later this afternoon.
Did he say about what? My chest tightened. Call it instinct or experience, but I had a feeling Tank planned to dump his son on Graham May and leave town. After being released from jail, he'd acted squirrely, the same way Darlene used to before she dropped me at Charlie and Dottie's and disappeared for months on end.
No, but I'd like for you to be there just the same. Come over after Quinn's doctor appointment.
Judging by the tired sag of her shoulders, she had the same concerns over Tank.
It's about time you and I sat down and talked about Killian.
While I hated to add more items to my don't want to do list, I knew I couldn't put it off forever. Will do.
Dottie said to give you this.
She handed me a mason jar. I held the glass container of yellowish-brown water to the light. What the heck is it?
Open it.
The mischievous glint in her eyes worried me. I knew I'd regret it, but I unscrewed the lid and inhaled. The pungent odors of onions and something akin to dead opossum filled my nose and throat. Ugh, gross! What am I supposed to do with this? Bryson returned, wearing a clean shirt and carrying a squirming, crying baby.
Good morning, May.
She ignored him and went straight for Quinn. Her taking him from us was nothing new. He'd spent almost as much time in her arms as ours, but this time she dropped him. Thankfully, Bryson caught him before he hit the floor. The baby's wailing hit tornado siren volume, but I didn't think he was injured. More than likely, the short free fall had scared him. From the looks of it, it had done the same to my great-grandmother. Her skin had gone 2 shades past pale, and she was cradling her arm. Jolene and the dog ran into the room, both with wide eyes. Jojo took in the scene and pressed her back to the wall. "Graham, are you okay?" I took her by the shoulders and guided her to the couch. "Sit. You don't look so good."
"I didn't hurt him, did I?"
Her voice shook as she glanced at Bryson and the baby.
"No, he's fine."
Bryson's expression told me he'd thought the same thing I had. Something was very, very wrong.
"Grandma, have you checked your blood pressure today?"
She waved her hand in his direction.
"Don't worry about me. I'm healthy as a horse."
I didn't believe her. "You don't look it. Did you check your sugar? How about your heart medication? Did you take it this morning?" I nodded at Aaron. "Call Dottie and have her check."
"The three of you can stop mother henning me. I pulled a muscle in my shoulder while weeding the garden."
She stood a little slower than normal.
"I brought onion water for Quinn. It helps with colic."
The devil would sell snow cones to polar bears before I fed my child that mess, but I knew better than to argue. "Thanks, Graham."
"Onion water?"
Aaron sniffed the jar and made a sour face.
"Whoa, this'll clear out your sinuses all right."
Bryson didn't look amused.
"Tessa, Aaron and I can handle the appointment. Why don't you stay and help me with an ice pack?"
"Aaron can do it. I want to hear what the doctor has to say." I appreciated what he was trying to do, but I wasn't about to stay behind. The second I'd learned I was pregnant, I'd promised myself I wouldn't be like Darlene. I wouldn't drop my child off on Grandma and Dottie's doorstep and disappear. I wouldn't miss a single thing in my son's life. Nope, I'd be there for every milestone, good day and skinned knee, even if that meant leaving my beloved great-grandmother in Aaron's hands.
"What did I just say?"
Grandma planted her hands on her hips.
"I'm fine. Go to the pediatrician, all three of you. Me and Jolene have plans to plant the fall vegetables this morning."
Jojo nodded and faked a smile. "Yes, ma'am, we do, but if you're sick—"
"Don't you start to."
Grandma pointed at the girl.
"We'll get to work once you're finished with your math lesson."
Jojo attended virtual school. Her ability to speak to the dead freaked out her classmates and her teachers too much for her to be in a regular classroom. She'd seriously slacked off on her lessons since her baby brother had been born, but I wasn't about to tell Grandma that. Aaron ran his hand over the back of his neck.
"I'll skip this one and help out. I'd planned to mend the fence while home on maternity leave."
While I didn't approve of lying, I wanted to hug him. He'd already replaced the rotted planks. My sweet and sometimes cranky husband had fibbed to save an old lady's pride. Grandma glanced between us as if she planned to argue, but seemed to change her mind.
"Good. I could use some help with the wheelbarrow."
"We need to get going." I grabbed the diaper bag and hurried to the porch before anything else could happen. Grandma called after me,
"Tessa Marie, don't mention the onion water to that fancy pediatrician. I doubt he'll approve, but it's worked for hundreds of years. It'll work now."
"Yes, ma'am." I slid behind the wheel while Bryson strapped Quinn into his car seat. Without a word, he climbed into the SUV and stared straight ahead. He had to be thinking the same thing as me, but neither of us seemed ready to admit our fears. I waited until we reached the edge of the property before I broke the uneasy silence. "She's sick, isn't she?"
"Her aura is much fainter than it was a month or so ago."
He squeezed my thigh.
"I believe the only thing keeping her going right now is sheer stubbornness."
My chest tightened at the thought of losing her. We have to do something. I mean, we have all of this magic. There has to be something we can do. Bryson cleared the emotion from his throat.
"Even magic has its limitations. There is a natural order to things that cannot be changed.
Can't be, or shouldn't be changed.
Does it matter?
He pressed his lips into a tight line and turned his head, but not before I saw a tear rolling down his cheek. Chapter 7. The visit with the pediatrician was a complete waste of time. After a few questions about Quinn's symptoms, drawing blood, obtaining a urine sample, and poking around, he'd diagnosed the baby with colic. Tell me something I don't already know, like how to fix it? Aaron met us in the driveway, looking rather peppy with his freshly shaved face and clean clothes.
What'd the doctor say?
Resisting the urge to bark at him for having the audacity to relax while we were away, I tapped my chin. Well, let's see. He told me to nurse longer on each breast, but not overfeed. Aaron wrinkled his brow.
How does that work?
Heck if I know. I leaned against the car and inhaled the warm afternoon air. He also told me to avoid dairy, cabbage, beans, spicy food, and anything that causes gas. Oh, and onions.
So much for Grandma's miracle cure.
He drew me into an embrace. I sagged against him, enjoying his clean man scent. I have no intention of feeding our son something that smells like roadkill. Bryson rounded the rear with Quinn fussing in his carrier.
She's not supposed to drink caffeine either.
Aaron gasped in mock horror.
Forget colic. Tessa without coffee is a threat to national security.
Ha ha. I hated to move. In fact, I could have fallen asleep standing in his arms, but I needed to feed Quinn. How's Grandma? Aaron glanced toward the empty garden.
She decided to take a nap rather than plant veggies.
Good. I followed the guys up the porch steps. Nothing felt good about the situation, but at least she'd taken it easy for a couple of hours. Aaron opened the front door for us.
May's expecting you.
I know, but I need to feed Quinn first. I turned to Bryson and held my arms out for the little one. Hand him over and go take a nap. He'd seemed distracted since we'd left the doctor's office. Not surprising, considering we were both worried sick and running on a couple hours of sleep. Welcome to parenthood. Maddie padded into the living room, sniffed each of us once, and Aaron twice. I couldn't blame her. He was the only one who'd had a shower. Bryson lifted Quinn from his carrier, but hesitated.
This all started after Killian visited.
Right. I braced myself for another discussion about feeding Quinn magic. But you heard what the doctor said. Colic usually starts in babies a week or so old. He nodded, but his stoic expression told me he didn't agree.
Hear me out, okay?
I can't hear anything over his crying. Give him to me. I made grabby hands. Bryson set the infant in my arms.
I don't know why I didn't think of this before, but could this be a spell?
Maddie let out a little woof and proceeded to circle me and the baby like a freaking shark. She stopped, stared, barked again, and continued to walk around us until Aaron pulled her out of the way. You think Killian put a crying spell on our baby? I settled into the recliner, freed a breast, and started the process of trying to entice Quinn to latch on.
The guy did steal a $400,000 car.
Aaron glanced out the window at the bright red bane of his existence. I'd known the car was expensive, but Lord in heaven! You're kidding! They cost that much? Aaron smirked.
It's a wonder a rainbow hasn't appeared in our front yard. It's worth as much as a pot of gold.
Maddie groaned and covered her eyes with her paws. What the heck is up with that dog? Bryson made a sound in the back of his throat, impatience mixed with frustration.
I don't know if he did or didn't do something to Quinn, but I intend to find out.
Can you do it after he's finished nursing? It's the only time he's quiet. I ran my fingertips over his fuzzy little head and smiled. Fussy or not, I was completely and totally in love with the little guy.
Sure. That'll give me time to get a quick shower.
He wandered down the hall with the dog following. A few seconds later, Bryson shouted,
Out!
The lab rejoined us in the living room. Enjoying the few minutes of bonding time, I closed my eyes. Unfortunately, Aaron's hovering made it impossible for me to relax. I cracked one eye open. Everything okay?
Just watching the two of you, thinking, I'm a lucky man.
He eased onto the arm of my chair and nudged Quinn's hand. The baby wrapped his tiny little fingers around his daddy's and sighed against me. Spoken like someone who got a nap. I rested my head back and closed my eyes again.
I'm sorry I was so difficult this morning.
I think we all get a pass on our crabbiness for the next month or so. The only thing keeping me awake was the fear of drooling on the baby or dropping him. The thought reminded me of my great-grandmother. I hate it, but I'm worried about Grandma holding him unsupervised. Aaron tensed, but nodded.
I'll let you have that conversation with her.
I figured the job would fall on my shoulders. She was my kin, after all. But I couldn't help teasing him. Why me? She likes you better, Detective Blue Eyes. Jolene shrieked loud enough to startle the baby. Dad, there's a spider in my room! Fumbling to get Quinn on my shoulder, I said, Go. You know she's terrified of them. Aaron shot into action, and so did the dang dog. Honestly, the girl could scare down the scariest of spirits without flinching, but the second an 8-legged friend crossed her path, she went into hysterics. I lowered Quinn to my other breast, and I knew I had a problem. His face turned stop-sign red and his little lip quivered. I had to act fast or I'd never get him calmed down enough to finish his meal. Shh, it's okay, Sweet Pea. Daddy's taking care of Jojo. His mouth hung open several heartbeats before he let loose a scream that rivaled a banshee. Try as I might, I couldn't get him to take a nibble. I gave up and burped him. He let loose a huge one, but cried right through it. Patting his hiney didn't work. Rocking him didn't work. Pacing the floor while feeling like the world's worst mother didn't work. Alone, exhausted and desperate, I panicked and lowered the imaginary shields that kept my magic contained. I had no idea how Killian had fed him, but I was determined to give Quinn anything and everything I could to calm him. Quinn continued to cry. If anything, he grew louder. I didn't want to hurt him or light him up like the 4th of July, so I pushed a tiny bead of magic through our skin-to-skin contact. Or tried to. It felt like shooting a squirt gun against a brick wall. The magic splattered across his skin and dissipated.
Tessa, is he finished?
Bryson called from the hall. Guilt overwhelmed me. The last thing I wanted was for Bryson to walk into the room and sense my magic. Hell, I'd be lucky if he hadn't felt it already. Yep, I'll bring him to you. I walked into the bedroom just as Bryson was pulling on a t-shirt. He glanced from me to the baby.
Everything okay?
Peachy, let's get this over with. I set Quinn on the king-sized bed and settled beside him. My guilt became palpable, so much so I could barely look at Bryson. He either didn't notice or didn't push it.
I'm going to focus my attention on rooting out any spells, but I need you to keep an eye on him while I do it.
Gotcha. It's the same process we use on adults, right? My voice came out strained.
Yes, but I need you to relax.
He held his hand an inch over the screaming infant's head. I drew a deep breath and did my best to resist the urge to comfort our child. It killed me to hear Quinn cry and know that even for a few moments I couldn't touch him. Quinn turned his head toward me and stared, as if begging me to pick him up. I leaned closer so that he could see my face, but I didn't dare speak for fear I'd break Bryson's concentration. Not that I thought the mystical skin would hurt him, but I didn't want to have to start over and prolong Quinn's misery. Hurry up. Please, hurry up. By the time he reached Quinn's feet, I thought I'd come out of my skin. Well? Shaking his head, Bryson cuddled Quinn to his chest.
Nothing. But if I didn't know better, I'd swear he was fighting me.
Maybe he is. I didn't doubt it for a second. Even at 2 weeks old, the child had a strong will. Then again, we'd experienced a similar situation before with an adult woman suffering from a dark curse. Could this be like what Betty Matthews had? He seemed to consider the question.
No. Even with Betty, we felt magic on her.
My mind raced with awful possibilities. Betty was cursed by a human magic user. What if fey powers work different? What if we're in so far over our heads we don't even know what to look for?
It's possible, but unlikely.
He turned for the door. I'm serious. We don't know what we don't know about the other fae. Killian was able to hear through the privacy spell the other day, and he checked out the wards. Be it my lack of sleep, lack of caffeine, or lack of common sense, I blurted out the absolute worst thing possible. He said our spells were rudimentary and primitive. I'd said our in hopes of softening the blow.
Is that so?
Bryson's shoulders fell as if I'd broken his heart. Without turning back to me, he said,
I'll reach out to Harrison. Unless you don't trust me to handle this.
I trust you absolutely and completely. I walked to him, took his free hand and brought it to my lips the same way he did each and every time he apologized to me. I shouldn't have said anything.
I'm not an egomaniac. I can admit your brother's magic is far stronger than mine.
A ghost of a smile curved his lips.
But that doesn't mean I like it.
Don't take any of this personally. It's the fear talking. Cupping my cheek, he said.
And the exhaustion.
I closed my eyes and focused on the warmth of his skin. The unquestionable knowledge he was my mate, 1/3 of a whole. My world. I love you.
I love you too.
He leaned forward and pressed his brow to mine.
We'll get through this. We've faced down much worse than a colicky baby.
Speaking of worst things, I need to go talk to Grandma.
Remember, sweet tea has caffeine. Take a box of decaf herbal with you.
Bryson winked. The heck with herbal tea. I'd need a 6 shots of whiskey to get through this conversation. Chapter 8. I'd majored in marriage and family therapy in grad school, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me to deal with my crazy family. If anything, my education made it worse. As a kid, I'd known we weren't like the folks on television, but I didn't understand how messed up we were. Sitting at my great-grandmother's kitchen table, there was no denying the truth. My family was a flaming hot mess. Could you repeat that? Grandma curled in on herself.
Charlie swapped you with Darlene's baby and bound your magic to hide you from the other fae.
I nodded slowly. Why did I need to be hidden? She met my eyes and dropped a bomb.
Because Achila was murdered before you were born.
Gawking, I sat back to put some distance between us, or maybe distance between me and the truth. How is that possible?
She was attacked left while still pregnant. Charlie delivered you after your mother took her last breath."
Grandma blew out a tired sigh. I stared into my mug because I couldn't bring myself to meet her gaze. I didn't want her pity or even her understanding. What I wanted was to scream and yell and demand she tell me why she'd lied to me my entire life.
At the time, he wasn't sure who sent the assassin to kill Achilla.
She kept talking, but I'd stopped listening after the word assassin. My mother wasn't just murdered. She was assassinated? Grandma patted my hand.
"I know this is a lot to take in."
I bit back an ugly reply. "Did he find out who ordered her killed?" Her patient smile made me wonder if she'd answered the question and I'd missed it.
"No. Charlie suspected Creve or her father, but Liam convinced him they didn't do it."
"Do you know who Liam suspected?" She shook her head. I took a sip of tea to give myself time to sort through my rushing thoughts. "So, my dad knows about me?" She glanced away.
"He knew Achilla was expecting his child, but assumed the baby died with her."
White spots danced before my eyes. I'm not sure if I set the mug down or dropped it. Either way, it crashed to the floor. Grandma stood, but rather than grabbing the dish towel, she took my hand and urged me to stand.
"Let's sit in the floor of the room where it's warm."
I didn't move. It didn't matter where we sat. No amount of sunshine was going to take the chill out of my bones. Why? Why would Charlie let his son-in-law believe he'd not only lost a mate, but a child?
"Tessa, I know this is hard, but you have to understand."
She eased back into her chair.
"Charlie had just lost his daughter. He didn't know who'd ordered her killed. He couldn't risk your safety."
I glanced up at the hitch in her voice. "He thought my father had something to do with it?"
"No, never. Not directly."
She folded and unfolded her hands.
"Liam was engaged to the Queen when he met your mom."
A flash of a memory crossed my mind. Killian said something about not being able to get away with jilting a monarch. Grandma pressed her lips into a tight line as if irritated with Killian or the conversation or me. Maybe all three. Too damned bad. Great-grandmother or not, she should have told me all of this long ago. But that doesn't make sense. You said you hadn't seen Killian in 65 years. Why would Charlie think Kiva had my mother killed after so long?
65 years seems like a long time to you and me, but time works differently there. Sometimes it stretches, sometimes it contracts.
I didn't want to get into the differences between Tiernan and Earth. Right, but that doesn't answer my question.
He suspected Kiva because Achilla was about to have a second child.
She stood and went to the cupboard for a dish towel and a dustpan.
"As far as I know, you and Killian were the last 2 children born in Tiernan."
Killian had said something similar, but I still didn't understand how that would lead someone to having Achilla killed. Buying myself a few moments to gather my thoughts, I took the rag from her and bent to clean up my mess.
"When Charlie died, I thought your magic would fade."
She handed me the dustpan.
"Instead, all hell broke loose."
That's putting it mildly. I'd been attacked by wolf shifters, taken a bullet to the heart, and almost killed by a power-hungry skinwalker, Not to mention, burned down my apartment and accidentally exposed Aaron to so many secrets the tribal elders had called for his death. I wish it would have faded. I'd given up the chance to allow the elders to bind my magic before Bryson and I were mated. However, that didn't mean I hadn't regretted my decision from time to time.
I can see why you'd feel that way. But think about all of the good you've done.
Out of breath, she sat back down. I guess. Walking to the trash can, I did my best to count my blessings. I would never have met Bryson, or stopped a handful of serial killers, or rescued Jolene from foster care and an annoying ghost, or saved a dozen or so lives. But still, why didn't Charlie bind all of my magic when I was born?
He promised Sheila he would leave enough to allow you to speak to her.
I couldn't begin to imagine what I'd make Aaron and Bryson promise to do if I knew I wouldn't leave to see Quinn grow up. The very thought made my throat tighten and eyes sting.
Sweetheart, I know you're disappointed in me, but we all made sacrifices.
Grandma pulled her sweater tighter around herself. I hated to put her through this, but I needed to know the truth. You're cold. Let's finish talking in the Florida room.
Thank you.
She took my arm and half leaned into me as we made the short trek to the back of her house. After she'd settled into her easy chair, she said,
Charlie brought us here and cut us off from the other Fae.
Including Killian and my father. I decided to keep that thought to myself, mostly because I was stuck on the way she'd said us and not himself. Was there more she wasn't telling me? Are you Fae too? Laughing, she motioned to her wrinkled face and cotton puff of gray hair.
Do I look like I don't age to you?
They age, just not as fast. I grinned despite the seriousness of the conversation. And you didn't answer my question.
I'm 100% human.
She shook her head.
Folks that live in Tirnanoke and other fairylands are immortal. They only age when in the human world.
Oh. Once again my thoughts raced. Had my grandfather given up immortality to be with Dottie? Or had he gone back and forth until I was born? Had he given it up for me? Charlie made a heck of a sacrifice. May's eyes glistened.
He and Sheila loved you very much, Tessa. They still do.
I've never doubted that, Grandma. I know you all love me. I just hate the secrets. I settled onto the little footstool in front of her chair like I had when I was a child. What's my father like? Did you know him? Grandma's eyes got that faraway look she had when remembering someone she'd loved.
He was a rascal.
Sometimes he acted like the sun came up just to hear him crow,
but I suspected that was all for show.
The more I heard, the more I wanted to know everything about him. Was he good to Achila?
Your mother was a tough cookie. She didn't take crap from anyone, especially not him. Liam adored her for it.
It felt like I'd woken up in an alternate universe. Growing up, I'd believed Darlene was my mom and my dad had run off. After I'd shifted into the Firebird, I'd learned the ghost who'd visited me for as long as I could remember was my real mother. I struggled to keep my bitterness at bay. I loved May and Charlie, and I trusted them to have done what they thought was best for me, but the lies? I didn't know if I could ever forgive the lies. Are you keeping anything else from me?"
"Only my secrets."
The mischievous glint returned to her eyes.
"I'll tell you in case Killian mentions something, but it's not something I want anyone else to know."
"Okay." I mimicked turning a key to lock my lips and braced myself for impact.
"My first love was a fae."
Her expression turned as dreamy as Jolene's did when talking about her movie star crush.
"His name was Teague, and he was a real looker. Had eyes even bluer than Aaron's."
"Tessa, sorry to interrupt, but y'all might want to see this," Aunt Dottie called from the living room, which might have been a good thing. May's cheeks had gone so red I worried her blood pressure had shot through the roof. The concern in Dottie's voice had me on my feet and moving. "What's wrong?"
"They interrupted my stories again?"
Grandma wrinkled her nose. She loved her soap operas. In fact, I was surprised we weren't discussing Achilles' death during commercial breaks. A reporter was interviewing a man that looked like he'd just walked off the set of Tiger King. The guy wore a dirty white tank top, jean shorts, and an honest-to-goodness mullet hairdo, complete with brassy yellow highlights. And that wasn't the strange part. His eyes were bugging out and he was hopping around like he had springs in his shoes. I couldn't help but giggle. Why do they always find the weirdest people in the bunch to talk to?
"There's been another animal attack. This one was only a few miles away from here."
Dottie motioned to the television, her way of telling us to hush.
I saw it. I saw it with my own 2 eyes. It weren't nothing like no animal I ever seen. It had a top half like a gator and the body of a man. It was like something out of a horror movie."
Mullet Guy turned and pointed to the lake behind him.
"It grabbed that woman and ripped her in two."
I sent up a prayer for the victim and an apology for making fun of a witness. I would have behaved like a lunatic, too, if I'd seen what he had, or thought he had. Lord, please let this man be hallucinating. The camera cut back to a male reporter.
"Multiple witnesses have reported seeing the same sort of creature on the shore. Police on the scene have declined to comment."
Mullet Guy continued to rant.
"There ain't nothing left of her. The gator man ate every last bit, even her clothes."
The audio cut out, and the images changed to a group of uniformed officers and a plainclothes detective standing near yellow crime scene tape. Tiny flashes of light glimmered behind them, as if someone had hung Christmas ornaments from the tree branches.
"My word!"
Dottie pressed her hand to her chest. Nothing that I'd just heard made sense. I'd seen a lot of horrible things while working with the police department, but I'd also interviewed enough traumatized people to know they didn't always get their facts right. It was probably a big gator. They like to drag their victims into the water.
"You're right."
She shuddered.
"But that isn't much better. Is that Aaron's partner?"
Grandma leaned forward to get a better look. As if he'd heard her question, the cameraman zoomed in on Detective Richard Samuel's scowling face. "It sure is." My stomach churned. Aaron had mentioned a series of fatal animal attacks and something about a possible serial killer. I knew my husband. There was no way he'd miss out on this case willingly. Dottie seemed to pick up on my unease.
"How much longer is Aaron taking off from maternity leave?"
"I'm guessing not very long." I couldn't help but think the trouble Gavin had warned me about had arrived. The screech of the screen door opening and slamming shut interrupted the conversation. "Grammy May!" TJ called from the kitchen. The boy sniffled and let out a sad little cry.
"Aunt Dottie? What in tarnation?"
Grandma pushed to her feet. "I'll get him." I reached the kitchen before she'd made it to the hall. TJ stood beside the table, holding a stuffed rabbit in one hand and a backpack in the other. Tears left clean streaks down his dirty face.
Daddy said me and David Hasselhoff were gonna stay here now.
I glanced behind him in hopes of finding his father, but the sound of tires on the gravel driveway told me all I needed to know. I knelt and wrapped my arms around the boy. It's okay, sweetheart. I've got you. Everything's gonna be okay. Chapter 9. After calming TJ down, I made my way across the lawn to tell Aaron and Bryson we'd have a pint-sized house guest for the foreseeable future. While I'd suspected this would happen, I'd hoped against hope that Tank would stick around and raise his son. After all, the boy had just lost his mother. I rounded the big oak tree and caught sight of Aaron pacing on the porch with his phone pressed to his ear. I didn't need psychic abilities to know who was on the other end of the line or what they wanted. Glancing at me, Aaron said,
Tessa's here now. I'll talk to her and call you back.
And that, folks, is how maternity leaves die. He hung up and gave me an apologetic smile.
Remember those wild animal attacks?
I saw the news at May's. Sounded like a gator to me. I'm sure they'll find the victim's remains when they search the lake. I had other things to discuss. Things that needed our immediate attention. Things that involved family, the fae, and the human sides. Aaron lowered his voice as if he expected the news media to pop out of the bushes with cameras.
They aren't releasing the details to the public, but CSI has found the same DNA at multiple scenes. Human DNA.
I swallowed my hurt for what I knew he'd say next and tried to beat him to the punch. Call Samuels back and tell him you're cutting your leave short. I know you're itching to be on the case. Aaron shook his head.
It's not just me they want back. They need you too, ASAP.
Me? Is he kidding? I hadn't told him about TJ, but I could hear Quinn crying from inside the house. Not to mention JoJo's schoolwork. And then there was the situation with my father. Killian could show up any time with a new plan to break our dad out of Tiernan Oak. No. I folded my arms and shook my head. Absolutely not. Do you hear me? I can't do one more thing. Not one more thing, Aaron Burns. He had the good sense to take a step back, but not enough to drop the subject.
Samuels needs you to walk 1 or 2 murder scenes. It won't take more than an hour or 2 tops.
I'd worked for the Orange County Police Department for the last couple of years. Officially, I was a victim's advocate. Unofficially, I helped out on hard cases by reaching out to the dead or by trying to read the murder scene. About 50% of the time, I could touch a reflective surface and see images of the crime. Other times I caught glimpses of the killer or clues, but there was a good chance I wouldn't see anything at all. There's no guarantee I can do it, and I'm not about to waste my time finding out. He grinned like he knew something I didn't.
I can guarantee you'll be able to read the scenes.
I lifted a brow, but otherwise refused to take the bait. He sighed.
Someone hung little mirrors around the areas where the killings happened.
I recalled the flashes of light behind Samuels and the other detectives. How in the world had the killer had time to hang mirrors? Better question, who had hung mirrors without anyone seeing him? It was a weird case, but it still was not my circus and not my monkeys. That's a unique M.O. But no, I'm not going back to work. Why don't you try dreamwalking and see if you can figure anything out? In the weeks before Quinn was born, Aaron had developed the ability to walk through the spirit world, visit people's dreams, and at times see a version of the future. Unfortunately, he'd shredded the veil and a boo-hag had come through the holes.
I'd rather not risk another monster crossing over.
Aaron dragged his hand down his face.
Please, Tessa. I wouldn't ask, but Samuels thinks there's another monster on the loose.
Images of Mullet Guy's terrified expression pushed against my resolve. That, added to what Dottie had said about the latest murder taking place a few miles away, had me second-guessing myself. Lucky for me, Quinn's crying amped up, giving me the perfect excuse to end the conversation. I'll think about it.
Thank you.
He blew out a relieved breath, as if he thought it was a done deal. It wasn't. Rather than argue, I moved past him and walked into the house. It took me a few seconds to understand what I saw. Quinn was in his baby swing, and Bryson was on his phone a couple of feet away. Brow furrowed, head down. He was so engrossed in the conversation he hadn't noticed me. The telltale tingle of magic hung in the air. He'd done a freaking privacy spell so he could take a call in peace. It was genius, but it felt like cheating. Although it would come in handy when we were taking turns getting up at night with the fussy baby.
I'll get Quinn.
Aaron knelt and began the headache of unfastening the straps holding our child in the contraption. Thanks. He's probably hungry. Speaking of which, I couldn't remember when I'd eaten last, but the mere thought of food turned my stomach. Stress could do that to a woman, but it had never done it to me. Normally, stress turned me into a human garbage disposal. Aaron handed me the baby.
I'll get you some decaf iced tea. Want a snack, too?
Nope. I suspected he was trying to butter me up. Petty or not, I didn't want his snack. Not when it had strings hanging off of it. Bryson turned and met my gaze. His expression reminded me of Aaron's outside. Upset, worried, and needing something from me. I ignored him and settled into my easy chair with Quinn. Unless he was speaking to Tank about reconsidering running off and leaving TJ with us, we had nothing to discuss. Bryson disconnected and dropped his phone in his pocket.
That was Buck. He called about the animal attacks. Not attacks, murders.
Aaron returned from the kitchen without my tea.
Samuels is working the cases. He's convinced it's a serial killer.
I would have put my hands over my ears and sang the alphabet song, but I was holding Quinn. Bryson's frown deepened.
Buck said the same thing. He thinks it's another skinwalker.
We'd faced down a skinwalker after Charlie died. During the ordeal, I'd been shot twice, kidnapped, almost lost Aaron, and shifted into the Firebird for the first time. Call me selfish, but I had no desire to repeat any of it. I don't want to hear any more about this. We have 3 kids to think about now.
3?
Aaron turned an odd shade of green. Bryson's expression grew serious, as if counting back to the last time we'd had sex. Newsflash, it couldn't have resulted in a pregnancy. I was still pregnant with Quinn. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. I've been waiting for you two to stop going on about the attacks to talk to you. Tank left TJ with Grandma and took off. We all know her and Dottie can't handle that little devil. Neither man's expression changed. If anything, Aaron looked queasier and Bryson more troubled. I know we have a lot on our plates, but he doesn't have anywhere else to go. I glanced between them. When neither spoke, I added, and he's used to staying here. Bryson nodded slowly, but avoided my gaze. To my surprise, Aaron caved first.
You're right. This is the best place for him.
That was too easy. I didn't trust it. Not that Aaron had a problem with TJ, but committing to take care of a rambunctious 7-year-old boy indefinitely was a big deal.
If it had to happen, now is a good time. We're all still on leave.
He hitched a shoulder.
Bryson and I will step up more around the house. That'll give you more time to yourself, you know, to do Tessa things.
Like salt on the damned case. Once again, Bryson did a slow nod. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. More like he was still mulling over the options. When he finally turned to me, I knew I had a problem.
TJ is welcome here as long as he needs a place to stay. But we need to pay Buck a visit soon.
I dropped my head back and groaned loud enough to disturb Quinn's meal. He jolted, all 4 limbs going rigid. Cooing softly, I shifted him to the other side in hopes of distracting him with a fresh boob. Thankfully, it worked. Bryson sat on the side of the couch closest to me.
I understand your reluctance to get involved, but Buck believes the first murder was near the tribal house.
What? I turned to Aaron for confirmation, but he seemed as stunned as me. Aaron tilted his head.
Was it reported? No.
Bryson tightened his jaw.
Buck said the victim was Cherokee, and he suspects the perp is a magic user. He doesn't want to involve the police. That's bullshit. Not all of the murders have taken place on tribal lands. He could be sitting on evidence that'll help solve the other cases.
Aaron's voice rose.
And if this does involve magic, we need to know what we're dealing with.
As much as I would have loved to ignore anything and everything about this case, I couldn't. Not if Buck was right. Human law enforcement was no match for a murderous magic user. Until meeting Harris, the Fey root doctor, and then Killian, Bryson and I had thought we were the only Fey left on the planet. But that didn't mean we were the only people capable of wielding magic. Some humans could use focus objects and spells to do serious amounts of harm. The thought of Aaron putting himself on this killer's radar made my pulse race. I walked the crime scenes, but that's it. I shifted Quinn to my shoulder and pegged Aaron with a death glare. And I don't think you should either. He winced as if I'd thrown a fireball at him.
It's my job.
Not for another few weeks, it's not. I drew a deep breath. Now, if the 2 of you will let me get a word in edgewise, there's another murder I'd like to solve. Grandma told me Achila was assassinated. Chapter 10. I walked along the edge of a patch of charred earth in the middle of the forest. Whoever, or whatever, had burned the ground had managed to create a perfectly round circle. Weirder still, dozens of square mirrors hung from the branches of the surrounding trees at what appeared to be the exact same heights. Grab the tape measure from my bag and measure the distance from the mirrors to the ground. Bryson gave me an odd look.
Why are you carrying around tools?
I like to be prepared. I kept the basics: screwdrivers, a hammer, wrenches, rope, duct tape, and a taser on hand when working. I'd be in serious trouble if I were ever pulled over and the police went through my crime scene bag. Buck scanned the tree canopy as if expecting to find the murderer perched on a branch. He was never much of a talker, and the stress of one of his own being murdered hadn't changed that. Tell me again what Oscar said happened. I would have loved to have spoken to the witness myself, but the young man had left town the day before. It was partly my fault we'd missed him. I'd insisted on visiting both death scenes on the same day. It had taken a solid week to coordinate Buck's, Samuel's, and my schedules. Not that I'd shared the information about the murder on tribal lands with Samuel's. As far as I was concerned, Buck was the person calling the shots on the small reservation. If he didn't want the local police department involved, that was his business. Aaron disagreed, loudly and often.
Oscar and Wyatt were returning from a hike. It was after dark.
Without taking his eyes off the trees, Buck drew in a long, slow breath.
They heard growling and thought it was a bobcat. Oscar claims he saw a half-man, half-cat walk out of the bushes.
Maybe I was in denial, but as bizarre as the burned circle and mirrors were, I wasn't ready to chalk up the goings-on to magic. Did he have a flashlight? Bryson moved to my side.
Wyatt and Oscar are shifters.
Oh, well, dang. That changed things considerably. Shifters weren't fae. They were born human and had been turned into a were-creature by either a bite or a deep scratch. Most had excellent senses of smell and eyesight. They'd be hard-pressed to mistake an actual animal for a human or vice versa. Buck nodded as if reading my mind.
Oscar tried to get the creature off Wyatt, but was knocked unconscious during the fight. He woke here, in the center of the circle. But Wyatt was gone. Oscar tried to track him, but couldn't find a trail. He said it was like they'd vanished into thin air.
I remembered Aaron mentioning the other victims had been seen with a tall male before the attacks. Did Oscar say anything about running into a dark-haired man on their hike?
No.
Buck folded his arms.
If there was anyone else out here, Oscar would have smelled them.
If he calls, please ask him if they ran into anyone. I turned to Bryson. Any idea what could have done this? He shook his head, but something in his eyes told me he had a few ideas. In fact, he seemed to be warning me with his stare. Against what, I didn't know. Bryson said,
The mirrors are exactly 5 feet and 3/4 of an inch from the ground. Whoever did this had to use magic.
Yep. I glanced up to where the strings were tied to the branches. Some were easily 20 feet high. I'll stop trying to convince myself this was a plain old human and read the mirrors now. Bryson chuckled. Buck bristled before walking several feet from the edge of the circle. I don't know what he expected to happen, but I didn't blame him for putting some distance between us. I focused on the cold magic inside me. Unlike the heat of the firebird, I had no need to call it forward. The icy magic seemed to ebb and flow through my body like a tide. I couldn't help but wonder if the difference between the two was an after effect of Charlie binding half my magic. The instant my fingertips brushed against the first mirror, images filled my mind. It was exactly as Buck had described. 2 young men walked into the clearing. A half-man, half-panther pounced on them from above. Blood. So much blood. Oscar shifting into a wolf. More fighting. Oscar unconscious. A flash of light so bright and hot it felt as if it had scorched my brain. Screaming, I released the mirror and pressed the palms of my hands to my eyes. They weren't physically burnt. The searing pain came from somewhere deep in my skull.
Tessa!
Bryson wrapped his arms around me and eased me to my knees.
What happened?
I managed to gasp out, Light! Burned! Inside!
Shift into the firebird.
His warm, safe magic flowed over my skin, but did nothing to ease the pain. All I had to do was let go and the firebird would burst into existence. The problem was, I couldn't focus on anything except the agony in my head. Bryson's spirit animal, the great hawk, hovered near the surface, but not even the call of her mate could rouse the firebird. His magic changed from coaxing to demanding to violent. It felt as if he'd reached inside me and pulled the damned bird out. 1 second I was writhing in his arms, the next I was a blazing ball of fire and feathers flying through the afternoon sky. On the bright side, the pain had vanished. I'd learned to think of the firebird as a part of myself instead of a separate creature. But after an injury, physical or magical, the bird seemed to have a mind of her own. She wanted her mate to shift and to go home to her young. Okay, so maybe I wanted the same thing, but the logical part of me knew I had to return to the charred circle. Eventually. Using my altitude and heightened eyesight, I scanned the area in hopes of finding broken branches, scraps of clothing, anything that would help me to figure out where the killer had taken Wyatt. There was nothing. Nada. Zilch. Oscar was right. It was as if they'd vanished. I returned to Bryson and Buck and shifted back into my human form, or almost human form. I held on to my heightened sight. Though a week had passed since the murder, there should have been traces of blood on the tree trunks or underbrush. Naked as a newborn and just as oblivious, I wandered the perimeter. Buck muttered something and turned his back. Bryson pulled his shirt over his head and handed it to me. Thanks. I slid it on and continued the search. This wasn't the first time I'd experienced an unplanned shift. I'd long since learned to keep a change of clothes in the trunk for such occasions. Unfortunately, the SUV was a couple of miles away. Bryson watched me with the same curious expression he'd worn when we'd first met. It was nice to know that after 3 years together, we hadn't lost the mystery.
Are you going to tell us what happened when you touched the mirror and what you're looking for?
I'm looking for blood. Growing frustrated, I gave up my search and turned to him. I saw everything, just like Buck described. After Oscar was knocked out, there was a flash of light that about melted my brain. It's what burned the circle. Buck tilted his head.
Could the killer have used the light as a distraction to run off unseen?
Maybe, but I didn't see a trail from the air. There would have been something. Broken branches, blood. Bryson balled and unballed his hands into fists, but otherwise remained stoic. I knew him well enough to know he'd figured something out. Something I was obviously missing. I opened my mouth to ask, but he stopped me with a slight headshake. Buck motioned between us and settled on Bryson.
What aren't you saying?
I had no idea what Bryson suspected, but whatever it was, he didn't seem to want Buck to know. I said the first thing that popped into my brain. There's no blood splatter anywhere. An attack that violent would have been messy. The killer would have tracked it into the forest. Buck's gaze went to the ground outside the circle. Bryson caught my eye and mouthed, "Thank you." He didn't seem the least bit surprised by my discovery. Further proof he'd figured something out. Buck scratched the side of his head.
The attack, what you saw in your vision, was violent.
It was. The memory of it made me lightheaded. He sighed the sigh of an old man realizing he'd woken up in a new and unfamiliar world.
Do you have any idea who or what the killer is?
No. I'm sorry. I hated to disappoint him, so I added, I'm heading to another crime scene now. Maybe I'll pick up on something there that will help all of this make sense. Buck glanced at my bare feet and legs.
Do you need to borrow some clothes?
Thanks, but I have some in the car. Heat flooded my cheeks, and it had nothing to do with the Firebird. It's funny how I rarely felt exposed until someone pointed out I was naked, or mostly naked. We made our way back to the tribal house in relative silence. Of course, it was hard to have a conversation while being carried piggyback style with no underwear. I spent most of the journey tugging on the hem of the shirt to make sure my butt was covered. Not that it mattered. Buck had gotten more than an eyeful when I'd shifted. The older man seemed lost in thought as we reached the pavilion along the back of the large building.
We will continue with Quinn's naming ceremony this weekend, as planned.
Bryson set me on my feet before turning his full attention to the chief.
I trust your judgment.
No, we should postpone it until we know what we're dealing with. The idea of bringing my newborn anywhere near where a murder had taken place made my palms sweat. Sure, it was tradition to present babies to the tribal elders before they were a month old, but I didn't see the rush. Bryson rested his hand on my shoulder, a sure sign he wanted me to zip it. I understood his desire to keep the peace between us and the elders, but not when it meant taking unnecessary risks with our family. Buck glanced back toward the forest.
If the killer was still out there, one of you would sense their magic, would you not?
Yes, but who's to say they won't come back? I turned to my husband for backup. We hadn't discussed it, but most of the magic users we'd dealt with over the years were associated with the tribe. For all we knew, the murderer had an invitation to the ceremony. Bryson remained quiet. I motioned to Buck. Didn't you say you thought this might be a skinwalker? He nodded. Then how do we know the murderer isn't a member of the tribe? I ignored Bryson's sigh and kept my focus on Buck.
I don't.
He folded his arms.
We will postpone the ceremony 1 week to make sure there are no other incidents on tribal land. Thank you, Buck.
Bryson dipped his chin, but not before I caught his grin.
Tessa, go get dressed. I'll call Samuels and tell him we're on the way.
Confused by his behavior, I headed to the parking lot and grabbed my spare clothes from the trunk. When I returned, the men were too involved in their conversation to notice me. Shaking his head, Bryson patted Buck's shoulder. The older man tilted his face toward the sky and frowned. I'd have asked if everything was okay, but I knew it wasn't. Buck was grieving. No amount of stupid questions, well wishes, or empty promises would take his pain away. After I dressed, we said our goodbyes to Buck and climbed into the SUV. As soon as Bryson shut the door, I said, "Were you really going to agree to have our son's naming ceremony with a murderer running loose?"
No.
He started the SUV and backed out.
I'd planned to wait until the shock of Wyatt's death wore off before discussing it with Buck.
Oh, I slumped.
It's okay.
He squeezed my thigh.
All's well that ends well.
I ran back through the events at the murder scene, but nothing made much sense. You looked like you were chewing iron in the forest. What did I miss?
The light in your vision. Was it the same as Killian's when he vanished from the living room?
He spoke without a glance in my direction. Smart man, because I gave him a dirty look that would have made Grandma proud. Considering Killian didn't burn the carpet, I'm gonna say no. In all fairness, I was overreacting. But I was sick of listening to Aaron moan and groan about my brother. I didn't want Bryson on the Killian is trouble bandwagon. This time he turned his head and met my gaze.
Those attacks started the same day Killian showed up at the house.
Huh. I hadn't done the math, but now that he mentioned it, I could almost see why he'd be suspicious. Almost. That's an odd coincidence. But do you honestly believe my new brother is running around as a Catman or Gator guy eating people? His lips twitched as if holding back a grin.
Not when you put it like that.
I laughed. It had been so long I'd almost forgotten how good it felt. Bryson entwined his fingers with mine and smiled like he used to, back when we had lots of sex and sleep and easy, breezy moments together. I lowered the window. The rush of cool air felt like freedom. Or it did, until my phone rang. Chapter 11.
Tessa, sorry it's been a few days since we spoke. How are you?
Killian's unmistakable voice filled my ear and worked its way into my heart. I'm good. Thanks for asking. It seemed strange to me to make small talk with him when we had a lifetime of catching up, of getting to know each other, of memories to make. But we had to start somewhere. How's Dad? Or should I call him Liam?
I'm sure he'd prefer you to call him Dad, or Da, like I do.
His tone reminded me of sunshine breaking through the clouds, full of hope and warmth.
He's a bit more chipper since I told him about meeting you.
He is? I felt like JoJo talking to Micah Sterling, her celebrity crush. I wanted to ask what Killian had told our father about me, or if he'd mentioned Quinn or Jolene or Bryson and Aaron. But more than anything, I wanted to ask if our father wanted to meet me. Killian lowered his voice to a sly whisper.
He's more determined than ever to break free.
To visit me? Hung on the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't bring myself to ask. 1, because I didn't want to sound like a dork, and 2, because I'd never smile again if I was wrong. That's good, right? Likely hearing the nervousness in my voice, Bryson squeezed my hand. The small gesture let me know he was there, no matter what.
Yes.
Killian cleared his throat.
I have a new plan. Is there somewhere quiet we can meet to discuss it?
The new mother in me heard the word quiet and automatically assumed he didn't want to come to the house because of the colicky baby. The more rational side of me figured he wanted to talk alone, as in without Bryson and Aaron. Neither of those options appealed to me. I'm handling a work situation, but I'll be home in an hour or so. You can stop by then.
I see.
Killian went quiet. I remembered the stolen Lamborghini and Aaron's threats to arrest him. On second thought, I'm starved. I know a great diner not far from my place. Bryson's grip tightened to the point of crushing my fingers.
Great. Text me the time and the address.
He disconnected the call. I fired off a quick text and dropped the phone in my purse. Risking a glance at my hubby, I asked, "Something the matter, Bone Crusher?"
I'd rather you not go alone.
Who said I was going alone? I didn't want to risk Aaron cuffing him and reading him his Miranda rights. I ran my fingers over the sensitive spot behind his earlobe. Any chance I can convince you not to mention this to Aaron until after we meet with Killian?
Keep doing that, and I'll consider it.
Bryson leaned into my touch.
Good idea having him meet you at Scarlett's Diner. I'll call her while you're working the next crime scene. I'm sure I can talk her into reading him on the down low.
And just like that, my mood soured. Scarlett was a seer. She could read a person's past through touch. One handshake, and the woman had a free pass to all of your secrets. While I was tempted, I couldn't do it. I'd much rather have Killian share his past with me the old-fashioned way, by building trust over time and good food. I picked the place because of the burgers, not the waitress. I pulled my hand away. I don't like the idea of her getting into his head without permission.
Since when does Scarlett ask permission?
He gave me side-eye. This is different. We're setting Killian up. Technically, every time we took someone to see Scarlett was a setup, but this felt wrong. I'd like to have an actual relationship with my brother. I'll ask him what I need to know.
You're right. Forget I mentioned it.
Bryson took my hand and placed a kiss on each of my fingertips. I spent the remainder of the drive in a haze of giddy anticipation about seeing Killian again and confusion over what I knew about the attacks. While Aaron liked to refer to them as murders, I wasn't so sure. Without a body or forensic evidence, it was impossible to say what had happened to Wyatt and the others. Bryson pulled up near the lakeshore and helped me out of the SUV. We walked hand in hand to the yellow police tape surrounding the death scene. Not long ago, I would never have participated in a public display of affection where my co-workers could see us. Everyone at the station knew Aaron, Bryson, and I were a throuple, but I'd gone out of my way not to rub their noses in it. However, at some point in the previous couple of months, I'd gotten over it. A few of the techs shot us curious looks, but for the most part, no one seemed to care whose hand I held. Aaron and Samuel stood shoulder to shoulder going over papers on a clipboard. What's Aaron doing here? He's supposed to be watching the kids. Mental images of Graham May force-feeding Quinn onion water flashed through my mind. Bryson said,
"He had Darlene help out long enough for him to be here while you walked the scene."
All the more reason to hurry this up. I understood why Aaron wanted to be on site while I did my thing, but I hated the idea of leaving Quinn with anyone. Aaron and Samuels smiled as I approached. Okay, that's different. I expected Aaron to smile. Samuels? Not so much. The man showed affection through ribbon and bird jokes, not facial expressions and hugs, but boy, oh boy, did he hug me.
"Tessa, good to see you."
He set me back on my feet, nodded to Bryson, and leaned close.
"What did you find at the other scene?"
I shot Aaron a glare that could have stopped the glaciers from melting. He held up both hands and took a step back. Samuels nudged my side.
"Off the record."
Off the record, I'll tell you if and when I find a connection. I pushed past him. Is the scene clear, or do I need the bunny suit? I seriously hated wearing booties, gloves, and a Tyvek bodysuit. My massive red curls never fit into the hood properly, and once my hair went into a ponytail, it was nothing but frizz. It might have been silly, but I wanted to look nice when I made up with Killian. Samuels tilted his head as if considering his options. I'd be far more cooperative without the full suit, but I'd contaminated a death scene or two in the previous couple of years. Aaron snapped on a pair of gloves.
"Sorry, darling. You're going to need the works." "She can't do her woo-woo thing wearing the gloves."
Samuels handed me a pair of booties.
"Put these on. You can reach most of the mirrors if you stick to the stepping plates around the perimeter."
Thanks. I slipped the paper covers over my spare running shoes and ducked beneath the tape. Careful to stay on the metal plates, I hopscotched my way around the edge to the first mirror.
"Hold up."
Bryson jogged to me, but remained on the other side of the tape.
"I'll stand by, in case you have an issue with the light."
Aaron joined me inside the cordoned-off area.
"Was there a problem with the other reading?"
Nothing a little shift in attitude couldn't handle. I winked and reached for the first mirror. Aaron rolled his eyes, but stayed within arm's reach. As with the first scene, images burst through my mind the second I made contact with the glass. Unlike the first scene, I was more interested in what happened before the attack than the attack itself. The vision started with the half-man, half-gator walking out of the water. As the mullet-wearing witness had said on the news, the creature ripped the woman in two before slinking back into the water with the body. I waited for the flash of light, but it never came. I moved to the next mirror and tried again. Like before, the images started with the gator guy walking out of the water. Nothing before.
"Everything okay?"
Aaron followed me to the third mirror. I'm not sure. I brushed my fingers across the glass, and the same images played through my mind like a GIF on a continuous loop. I moved to the next mirror and sighed when I got the same results. Bryson gave me a less than patient look.
"Anything?"
No flashes of light, but something's wrong. Dozens of mirrors hung from the trees. It'd take hours to read them all, and I highly doubted I'd see anything different. I glanced back at Aaron. How far off the ground are the mirrors? He arched a brow. How many inches? I waved my hand like a lunatic. I don't know. He met my gaze, sighed, and nodded back toward the CSI tent.
I'll go find out.
Thanks. I surveyed the scene again. The lake was to my left, the parking lot to my right. The creature had come from the water, but in the vision, he'd come directly at the mirror. I nodded to Bryson. I need to check something. Stay close. Without a word, he followed me to the opposite side of the perimeter. I touched the mirror and noted the positions of the lake, the parking lot, and the tree. My pulse picked up steam as the implications of my discovery played through my head. This is definitely magic. It defies the laws of physics. My brain churned quicker than my mouth could keep up. The images, all the same angles, same everything. It's staged. Bryson opened his mouth, snapped it shut, and shook his head.
What's staged?
Aaron's voice startled me. I jumped half out of my skin, but managed to keep my feet on the dang stepping plates. Didn't anyone ever tell you not to sneak up on someone at a murder scene?
Sorry about that, but you're darn cute when you're flushed.
He flashed me a dimpled smile before shifting back into work mode.
What do you mean, staged?
Every vision showed the gator guy walking out of the water head on, with the parking lot on the right and the lake on the left. I motioned to the mirrors nearest to the lake. From there, I should see him walk by. Aaron pointed to the one I'd read last.
And this one should show the parking lot on the left.
Nodding, I said, the weird thing is, I can't see anything before the guy comes out of the water or anything after he goes back into the lake. Aaron rubbed his jaw.
That's unusual. Why?
Because the visions are like memories, not movies. There isn't usually a beginning and end when I read an object. If I'm connected to it, I can see hours in the reflection. Bryson glanced at Aaron.
How high are the mirrors from the ground? 5 feet and 3/4.
He growled under his breath.
Tessa, stand directly behind that mirror.
What? Why? I glanced back at him. He wore the same hard and uncompromising expression he had on the tribal lands when he'd suspected Killian had something to do with the light.
Humor me.
It took some finagling, but I managed to position myself with the mirror hanging in my face without stepping off the plate.
They're hanging at eye level.
Bryson folded his arms.
What does that prove? Only at Tessa's eye level.
Aaron's mouth fell open.
It's like the perp knows how your magic works and laid out the perfect scene for you.
Bryson scowled.
It's not just staged. It's a setup specifically for Tessa.
It took me a couple of heartbeats to catch on, and when I did, I thought I'd vomit. You think someone's setting me up? For what?
That's a very good question, but I suspect this is what Gavin was warning you about.
Bryson glanced over the area before nodding back toward the parking lot.
Let's get you home where it's safe.
But I'm meeting Killian. Shoot. My mouth had gotten away from me. A quick glance at Aaron told me he'd heard and had some serious opinions about my lunch plans.
This has been part 1 of The Spirit Dancer, Tessa Lamar novels, Book 5. Written by Kathryn M. Hearst. Narrated by Holly Adams. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please subscribe to Kathryn's channel where you can find part 2 of The Spirit Dancer, along with more of Kathryn's paranormal and contemporary romance novels.